Welcome to Victorian Britain, an era that believed civilization was held together not by progress, but by manners and punishment. It was the 19th century's grand social experiment. Take a rapidly industrializing world, coat it in a moral varnish, and pray no one notices the smell of hypocrisy. This was an empire where your clothes declared your worth, your accent dictated your destiny, and your actions, no matter how trivial, might land you in front of a magistrate. It was the age when Britain ruled the world and yet panicked endlessly that its own citizens might get ideas. The Industrial Revolution had given people factories, trains and newspapers, but also overcrowded slums, gin-soaked despair and social mobility that terrified the upper crust. The result? Society obsessed with order. Everything had to be catalogued, labelled and, if possible, punished. If morality were a sport, Victorians were competing for gold. The middle class, in particular, treated virtue like a fashion accessory. You wore it loudly, even if it didn't fit. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Public life became one enormous performance of decency. A misplaced button or an unpolished boot might make you look ungovernable. Respectability wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Police patrols, reform societies and do-gooding moralists began criminalizing what had once been considered ordinary human behavior. Poverty, laughter, or even standing still too long could suddenly make you suspect. The streets were alive with new laws, each one designed to remind people that civilization was fragile, and you might be the one to ruin it. The invention of the modern police force in the 1830s only added fuel to the fire. Officers were sent out with vague instructions to maintain public order, which in practice meant arresting anyone who looked like they couldn't afford a lawyer. Their greatest weapon wasn't the baton, it was boredom. When nothing serious was happening, they simply invented crime. Loitering, drunkenness, shouting, even excessive cheerfulness could count as offences if a constable was having a slow day. And the courts? They were a theatre of the absurd. Magistrates handed down sentences with all the gravity of a Greek tragedy to people who'd stolen half a loaf of bread or looked at a police officer the wrong way. Newspapers were filled with breathless accounts of alarming disturbances, which often turned out to be someone singing off-key or arguing with a lamplighter. To modern ears, it sounds like parody. To Victorians, it was civilization's defence mechanism. The deeper issue was fear. Fear that the lower classes, emboldened by wages, reading, and the occasional opinion, might upend society's delicate hierarchy. So the law became a tool to remind them of their place. Petty crimes weren't about danger, they were about discipline. The punishments were public, theatrical and moralising, all designed to reassure the respectable that the world still made sense. Of course, hypocrisy was the national pastime. The same gentlemen who decried vice in Parliament were often found in the company of the very women their laws condemned. Brothels, gin palaces, and gambling dens thrived under the watchful eye of reformers who somehow never managed to notice them. The empire that claimed to bring civilization abroad couldn't stop arresting its own citizens for existing imperfectly at home. Victorian Britain's obsession with crime was also a form of entertainment. The public devoured crime stories, penny dreadfuls, and moral pamphlets that described every lurid detail, all while pretending to be horrified. People tutted at criminals by day and read about them by gaslight at night. Crime was the guilty pleasure of the self-righteous. The poorer classes became the villains in this national soap opera, thieving, rioting, and generally spoiling the illusion that the empire was one big Sunday sermon. If you were rich, crime was scandalous. If you were poor, it was destiny. The same act could earn you pity or prison, depending on your accent. A shoplifting duchess might be described as unwell, a hungry labourer, incorrigible. And heaven help you if you were a woman. Female offenders were moral disasters waiting to happen. Even the mildest transgression could ruin a reputation forever. Victorian mercy, it turned out, was strictly rationed. So why all this moral hysteria? Because the Victorians were inventing the modern world, and they were terrified of it. Steam engines, telegraphs, urban crowds, everything was changing faster than anyone could morally justify. Crime, in their minds, wasn't just theft, it was disorder. And disorder threatened the illusion that Britain was a shining beacon of progress, rather than a messy, anxious, overcrowded island trying to keep up with its own inventions. In short, the Victorians turned everyday life into a legal obstacle course. You could be punished for being drunk, loud, lazy, poor, or simply alive in the wrong neighbourhood. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are the constables. And so begins our journey into the pettiest crimes ever devised, where theft, poverty, laughter and love were all treated with equal suspicion. Strap in, keep your hands visible, and for heaven's sake don't make eye contact with the magistrate. You might be loitering. Imagine this, you've done nothing wrong, no theft, no mischief, not even a slightly impolite glance. Yet the simple fact that your boots have holes in them means you're a walking arrest warrant. Welcome to Victorian Britain, where poverty wasn't just unfortunate, it was illegal by aesthetic. The empire might have been built on the backs of the working class, but heaven forbid those backs be seen in public without respectable tailoring. Under the Vagrancy Acts, first passed in 1824 and tightened throughout the century, being visibly poor was treated as a criminal offence. These laws were designed in theory to stop wandering beggars, pickpockets, and idle persons. In practice, they became the legal equivalent of, "You look suspicious, that'll be 6 months in jail." Police didn't need evidence of a crime, they just needed evidence of you. If you were found wandering abroad without visible means of subsistence, you could be arrested on the spot. Translation: if you didn't have a job, a home, or the right kind of coat, congratulations, you were officially a threat to the social order. The Victorian middle class wanted the streets clean, not of dirt but of reminders. Nothing spoiled a stroll through London's shiny new shopping arcades like a human being who couldn't afford shoes. It wasn't just the homeless who suffered. The working poor, dockers, matchgirls, factory hands, all risked suspicion if they lingered too long in public. A man taking a rest on a park bench might find himself hauled before a magistrate for idling. A woman waiting outside a shop too long could be branded a public nuisance, and the constables, eager to please their superiors, loved these arrests. They were easy, visible, and didn't require chasing anyone. The irony was that Victorian Britain created the poverty it punished. The Industrial Revolution had turned cities into overcrowded, soot-stained hives, where tens of thousands lived hand to mouth. Wages were pitiful, work was unstable, and unemployment was a constant shadow. Yet rather than address this, lawmakers decided the problem wasn't poverty, it was the appearance of poverty. By the mid-19th century, Britain's great cities had developed an entire vocabulary for looking poor. Words like shabby, slovenly, and ragged weren't just insults, they were practically legal classifications. Charitable reformers and city planners spoke of undesirable persons, as if they were a species to be managed. Street lighting, for instance, wasn't just for safety, it made it easier to spot the destitute. It was moral illumination. For the wealthy, cleanliness and order were proof of virtue. Filth and disorder were proof of sin. The idea was simple. If you were poor, you must have done something to deserve it. Perhaps you drank too much, prayed too little, or simply failed to manifest a decent waistcoat. Either way, your poverty was a sign of your moral bankruptcy, and society's solution was to arrest you until you stopped being inconveniently visible. The poor didn't just disappear into prisons, they were funneled into workhouses, those grim monuments to moral correction. Workhouses were part punishment, part social experiment, and part warning to everyone else. They were designed to make poverty so unpleasant that no one would choose it, as if starvation were a lifestyle decision. Conditions were intentionally harsh. Families were separated, meals were meagre, and labour was endless. The message was clear, the price of charity was humiliation, and yet the streets still overflowed with the poor. Beggars, match sellers, shoe blacks, flower girls, all part of the living wallpaper of Victorian cities. Writers like Charles Dickens and Henry Mayhew tried to humanise them. But society preferred caricatures, lazy, conniving, untrustworthy. The undeserving poor became a convenient scapegoat for everything from rising crime rates to moral decline. Never mind that most so-called vagrants were victims of unemployment, illness, or sheer bad luck. One particularly cruel twist was that even seeking help could mark you as a criminal. Begging, no matter how desperate the situation, was illegal. Asking for bread could land you in the same cell as a thief, because both were seen as moral failings. As one magistrate cheerfully declared, "It is better they be punished than encouraged." Victorian logic in a nutshell: fix poverty by arresting it. The absurdity of the system was breathtaking. Newspapers recorded cases of people jailed for sleeping rough, wandering without purpose, or simply appearing destitute. A man could be imprisoned for having no shoes, and when he was released, still without shoes, rearrested for it again. The cycle was almost elegant in its cruelty. This obsession with appearances shaped the entire urban landscape. The poor were pushed out of sight, hidden in back alleys, displaced by development, and constantly relocated by the police. Middle-class neighbourhoods installed iron fences and lamppost warnings, no loitering, even cemeteries segregated by class. The wealthy feared poverty not just as misfortune but as contagion, and through it all, the language of morality coated everything like a layer of... Politicians spoke of instilling discipline, newspapers praised the triumph of respectability, and clergymen delivered sermons about the moral hygiene of the city. The message was clear. Society wasn't cruel, it was cleansing. Poverty was dirt, and dirt must be scrubbed away. So yes, your greatest crime in Victorian Britain might not have been theft, rebellion or heresy. It was simply failing to afford a decent waistcoat. And if your shoes were scuffed or your hat too old, beware. A constable might decide that your very existence was a disturbance to the peace. The Victorians didn't just invent modern morality, they weaponised it. To look poor was to look guilty, and in the age of overreaction, guilt was all the evidence anyone needed. If there's one thing Victorian Britain feared more than revolution, it was relaxation. Standing still too long in a park, a street corner, or heaven forbid outside a shop, could turn you from respectable citizen to suspected criminal faster than you could say, "I'm just waiting for my friend." In an era obsessed with movement, stillness looked like plotting. The law called it loitering with intent. Intent to do what exactly? That was the beauty of it. No one ever had to specify. The police didn't need proof you were planning a crime. Your crime was looking like you might be planning one. A man standing alone near a lamppost might be casing a shop. A woman lingering near a corner might be soliciting. A group of youths chatting outside a factory, clearly a gang in the making. In short, the safest way to avoid arrest was to never stop moving, preferably with purpose, pace, and a socially acceptable facial expression. The rise of the modern police force in the 19th century gave officers an entirely new hobby: patrolling morality. With streets lit by gas lamps and widened for carriages, cities like London became surveillance zones where visibility equaled vulnerability. The constable's job wasn't just to stop crime, it was to prevent the possibility of crime. Loitering, with its vague aura of idleness, became the perfect offence for a society terrified of disorder. The idea of criminal intent fascinated Victorians. They believed that you could see it in a person's stance, expression, or general aura of undesirability. Scientists, journalists, and reformers all wrote about criminal faces, as though morality were printed on the forehead. Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso famously claimed he could identify a criminal by their jawline. The British police, never once to waste an excuse, took that theory and ran with it, right into the nearest pub, where they could arrest someone leaning against a wall with intent. Loitering laws became social tools rather than legal ones. They allowed the police to remove anyone who didn't look right. That could mean the poor, the unemployed, street performers, or anyone whose fashion sense didn't scream middle-class virtue. You didn't need to commit an act. You just had to exist in an inconvenient location. Take London's bustling streets. By day, full of workers and shoppers. By night, full of suspicion. If you paused near a shop window after hours, a constable might assume you were eyeing the merchandise for a midnight visit. Wait too long at a train station without a ticket. Must be plotting to rob someone's luggage. Sit on a curb to rest your feet. Congratulations, you're now causing obstruction. For women, the consequences were even worse. A woman alone in public space was automatically suspicious. If she stood still too long, outside a theatre, near a tavern, or on any street after dark, she risked being charged under solicitation laws. Police didn't need proof she was a sex worker. They only needed the vibe. Innocent women walking home from work could be accused, arrested, and fined. Their reputations destroyed in a single evening. The Victorian paradox was clear. A woman's place was in the home, and if she couldn't afford one, that was her fault and her crime. Urban planners made things worse. New boulevards, rail stations, and shopping arcades were designed not only for beauty but for surveillance. Wide open spaces made loiterers easier to spot. Even architecture was moralised. Benches were scarce, doorsteps gated, and railings sharpened to prevent sitting. The city itself became a moral obstacle course. The message was simple. Keep walking, keep working, and for heaven's sake, don't loiter. Public parks, supposedly built for relaxations, came with their own list of prohibitions. Don't lie down, don't sit too long, don't gather in groups larger than 2 without a purpose. Essentially, the park was for walking briskly, admiring flowers at a moderate pace and leaving immediately once you were done being wholesome. Any hint of leisure could be seen as subversive. Victorian advice never stopped to think. It's incriminating. Even children weren't immune. Street kids selling papers or shining shoes were often accused of loitering between jobs. Hanging around waiting for a customer was treated like evidence of criminal plotting. Many were sent to reform schools, which were less about education and more about teaching young people how not to be visible. The logic was brutal but efficient. If you keep the poor moving, they have no time to cause trouble. The loitering laws also revealed deep class bias. The idle rich could promenade, lounge, and take air in Hyde Park for hours without anyone questioning their intentions. Their leisure was elegance, the poor man's was menace. It wasn't what you were doing, it was who you were while doing it. Respectable stillness was called contemplation. Working class stillness was loitering with intent. Of course, this paranoia about standing still came from something deeper, a national anxiety about time itself. The Victorian world ran on clocks. Factory whistles, train schedules, and business hours carved life into minutes. Idleness was waste, and waste was sin. To stand idle was to resist progress, and resistance looked suspiciously like rebellion. The law simply gave that suspicion teeth. In truth, loitering arrests served a psychological purpose for society. They reminded everyone, especially the lower classes, that visibility came at a cost. You could exist, but only productively. You could move, but only towards something profitable. The moment you paused to rest, reflect, or simply exist outside the machinery of labour, you became a danger to the order that ran the empire. So next time you imagine Victorian London, the clatter of horse hooves, the hiss of gas lamps, the fog curling through cobblestone alleys, remember the silent menace lurking behind it. A constable watching you stand still too long. To breathe, to think, to hesitate was to risk being labelled a criminal. The good news, you're innocent. The bad news, you stopped walking. In the glittering empire of Queen Victoria, crime didn't always come with a mask and a getaway horse. Sometimes it came with an empty stomach. The Victorians called it theft. History calls it trying not to starve. Among the working poor, stealing food was so common it might as well have been another form of taxation, the hunger tax, payable in hard labour and public humiliation. This was the age of moral contradiction, a society that celebrated Christian charity while punishing hunger like it was a personality flaw. The Industrial Revolution had built factories, railways and mansions, but it had also built slums so tight that sunlight was practically a rumour. Thousands of families scraped by on wages that could barely feed a single child. And when there was no money for bread, well, the bakery window was just sitting there, practically winking. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival. For many labourers, a loaf of bread was the difference between working another day or collapsing in the street. Yet stealing it, even a crust, was treated as a capital offence against civilization itself. The courts didn't care that your belly was empty. They cared that property law was sacred. The baker's right to profit outweighed your right to live. The result was a bizarre epidemic of petty theft cases, recorded endlessly in the police gazettes. A woman aged 22 apprehended for stealing a loaf of bread. A boy, 10, found guilty of taking apples from a stall. A man, unemployed, accused of absconding with 2 onions. The details changed, but the verdict rarely did. Guilty. The punishment? A fine you couldn't pay, or imprisonment you couldn't avoid. For repeat offenders, or anyone judged incorrigible, there was a more dramatic solution: transportation. Yes, for stealing a loaf of bread, you could be shipped halfway across the planet to Australia. The Victorians called it rehabilitation. The Australians called it importing criminals with useful trade skills. In the 1840s, whole ships set sail packed with petty thieves, pickpockets and hungry children, all sentenced to 7 years' improvement in the colonies. The good news? You got a free ticket to warmer weather. The bad news? You had to earn it by surviving. The absurdity didn't end there. Jails were overflowing, not with murderers or spies, but with the desperate. Inside, prisoners were treated as moral failures in need of correction. They were put on hard labour, meaning they spent hours breaking stones, picking oakum, or walking endlessly on treadwheels, gigantic hamster wheels of misery designed to teach discipline. The goal wasn't to reform thieves, it was to break their spirit. You stole bread because you were hungry, perfect, here's some meaningless bubble to help you reflect on that mistake. The newspapers of the time reported these cases with an almost religious smugness. Middle-class readers devoured stories of theft by the idle poor, as if they were cautionary tales. Yet occasionally, even the journalists couldn't ignore the injustice. Some reports described women weeping as they were sentenced for stealing a loaf to feed their children. A few sympathetic magistrates even scolded society instead of the accused. But sympathy was rare, sentiment didn't pay taxes, and of course class determined everything. If a hungry street boy took bread, he was a criminal. If a wealthy man borrowed from public funds, he was a financial innovator. The poor stole to live, the rich stole to decorate, and the law punished accordingly. Victorian justice was less about right and wrong and more about who could afford to be wrong. Children were frequent culprits in the bread theft epidemic. Many worked 12-hour days selling newspapers or sweeping chimneys, earning pennies that couldn't buy supper. A single misstep, hand-reaching for food, could land them in reform schools, which were basically miniature prisons dressed as moral academies. Here they were taught discipline, religion, and how to break their will without breaking the law. The theory was noble: turn thieves into honest citizens. The practice was cruel: turn children into obedient ghosts. Women, too, faced special humiliation. Female offenders were paraded before the courts as warnings to others, described as fallen or abandoned. The logic was clear. If a man stole bread, he was desperate. If a woman did it, she was morally defective. Judges often sermonized about virtue before sentencing them to months of confinement, because nothing restores morality quite like starving in a cell. The bread theft cases revealed the uncomfortable truth at the heart of Victorian morality. Compassion had a price tag. Charity was fashionable when it was public and selective, but invisible when it mattered most. Reform societies handed out Bibles faster than meals, and while preachers thundered about the virtues of self-restraint, Factory owners paid wages that barely bought a candle, let alone dinner. There were moments of rebellion, too. Small acts of resistance from the hungry masses. In some cities, food riots broke out when prices spiked or harvests failed. Crowds stormed bakeries shouting, "Bread or blood!" In response, soldiers were called in to protect the loaves. It was the ultimate symbol of Victorian priorities. Defend the bread, not the people who needed it. By the late 1800s, social critics like Dickens and Henry Mayhew exposed these hypocrisies in print. Their stories of ragged children and overzealous judges helped spark debate about reform. But the system was slow to change. Hunger remained a crime of visibility, one you paid for in the sweat, tears, and occasionally a one-way trip to the other side of the world. So yes, in Victorian Britain, stealing a loaf of bread could make you an international traveller. It's hard to imagine the conversation. "Your Honour, I was hungry." "Excellent. Let's see how you do in New South Wales." At least as the joke went, the weather improved. Victorian Britain ran on three things: coal, hypocrisy, and alcohol. Gin was the unofficial fourth. The nation's moral backbone might have been built on sermons and etiquette, but its actual backbone was half-pickled. Everybody drank. The rich, the poor, the politicians who wrote the laws and the constables who enforced them. Yet somehow being visibly drunk became one of the great social evils of the 19th century. In other words, you could sip gin demurely in your parlour, but if you stumbled while singing in the street, society would suddenly remember it had standards. The Victorians loved to pretend they were the sober generation that had tamed the gin-soaked chaos of the 18th century. In reality, they just changed where and how they drank. The middle and upper classes did it respectably, behind lace curtains, in gentlemen's clubs, or in the company of crystal decanters and polite denial. The working classes, however, drank publicly, in taverns, gin shops, or out in the open after a grueling 14-hour shift. That visibility was their real crime. Public drunkenness wasn't about drunkenness, it was about class optics. The 1839 Metropolitan Police Act gave officers the right to arrest anyone found drunk and disorderly in public. That phrase, drunk and disorderly, was as flexible as a rubber band. A single hiccup could count as disorderly conduct. Singing too loudly could be seen as a threat to civilization, and God forbid you try to argue with an officer while intoxicated. That was practically a crime against the Queen herself. The irony was that the police themselves often smelled like the evidence. Victorian constables were notorious for popping into pubs between patrols, which made for some truly poetic courtroom scenes. "Did you, sir, witness the defendant in a state of drunkenness?" "Yes, Your Honour, right after my third pint." To the respectable classes, the sight of a drunk labourer wasn't just distasteful, it was symbolic decay. Reformers wrote furious pamphlets warning that gin was turning Britain into a moral wasteland. Temperance societies popped up everywhere, led by earnest people who firmly believed that sobriety was the key to salvation and possibly better table manners. They held rallies, distributed pledges, and replaced taverns with coffee houses, which were about as fun as they sound. Imagine ordering a nice warm milk after 12 hours of shoveling coal. But the temperance movement had another, less noble goal: control. By regulating how and where people drank, the middle class could shape public behaviour. Drunkenness in private meant tired from work. Drunkenness in public meant danger to society. One was excusable human weakness. The other was moral collapse. The message was clear, but it wasn't the alcohol they despised, it was the visibility of working-class joy, and nothing scandalised a Victorian moralist quite like drunken singing. Music was fine in a drawing room, but a drunken chorus in the street? That was the sound of civilization collapsing in three-quarter time. Policemen treated groups of singing men or women as mobs, and tavern songs as the first step toward riot. The logic went like this: first you sing, then you dance, then you overthrow the government. You could drink gin privately, but if you started singing, that was sedition. Punishments for public drunkenness were brutal in their pettiness. First offenders might be fined a few shillings, money they likely didn't have. Repeat offenders could be sentenced to short stints in jail or hard labour. Women, especially, were targeted for drunken disorder. The sight of a woman swaying in public was treated as proof of moral ruin. Newspapers loved to print these cases with scandalised headlines like, "Intoxicated female found singing hymns at midnight." For men, the tone was different, but equally patronising. Drunkenness was seen as weakness, a failure of self-discipline. Reformers claimed it led to crime, unemployment, and domestic cruelty. They weren't entirely wrong. Alcoholism destroyed families and livelihoods, but their moral framing turned complex social problems into simple caricatures. A drunk man wasn't sick or desperate, he was sinful. The gin palaces became the battleground for this moral war. These glittering establishments sprang up across London in the 1830s and horrors, offering cheap spirits and dazzling gaslight interiors that made poverty feel momentarily glamorous. To the poor, they were warmth, light, and temporary escape. To reformers, they were hell on earth, seductive traps luring the working classes into vice. Some temperance activists even described gin palaces as Satan's chapels, which admittedly does sound like a great name for a band. Not that the wealthy abstained, they simply drank better branding. The upper classes had wine, port, and brandy, expensive, imported, and therefore socially acceptable poisons. The hypocrisy was almost artistic. A dockworker's gin was vice, a duke's port was tradition. The line between sin and sophistication was measured in price per bottle. Then there was the drunk tank, the Victorian solution to rowdy evenings. Police stations developed holding cells specifically for the intoxicated. These were grim little rooms lined with straw, where prisoners could sleep it off, often while being lectured about the moral dangers of their own existence. Repeat visitors were listed in police reports as habitual drunkards, which could lead to long-term institutionalization in asylums. Yes, you could literally drink yourself into a diagnosis. The obsession with public drunkenness said less about alcohol and more about control. It gave the authorities an easy excuse to sweep up anyone inconvenient, the loud, the poor, the homeless, or the politically restless. The sight of a staggering body was a reminder that not everyone was marching in polite formation toward progress, and the Victorians couldn't stand that kind of rebellion. And yet, behind closed doors, the same moralists raised their glasses nightly. Politicians toasted the empire over brandy, clergymen sipped sherry for digestion, writers like Dickens and Thackeray were known to enjoy the occasional pint, or 5. The hypocrisy was so baked in that by the end of the century, even reformers had started to quietly drink for medicinal reasons. So if you ever time travel to Victorian London, remember the rule of thumb: drink by all means. Everyone did. Just don't laugh, don't sing, and don't look too happy about it. Because in an empire built on repression, even joy needed a license. The good news, the gin was cheap. The bad news, so was your freedom. Victorian Britain loved words, just not the wrong ones. This was a century that produced Dickens, Tennyson, and 1,000 moral sermons, all insisting that language defined civilization. But use the wrong word, say one beginning with low or ending with a die, and congratulations, you are now a criminal. In an era obsessed with manners, even your expletives had to be respectable. Yes, swearing in public was a genuine offence, not metaphorically offensive, legally punishable. The law called it profane or obscene language, and it came with fines, jail time, or, at the very least, a very stern lecture about your eternal soul. The Town Police Clauses Act of 1847 gave constables the right to arrest anyone using profane, indecent, or obscene language in any public thoroughfare, which meant that if your horse threw a shoe, your cart broke down, and you said what any sane human would say, you could expect a constable to appear from the mist and slap you with a summons. Swearing wasn't just impolite, it was seen as moral rot made audible. Reformers claimed that profanity corrupted not only the speaker but everyone within earshot. It was, in short, an airborne sin. And because Victorian Britain adored policing things it couldn't actually measure, like virtue, decency and tone, swearing became the perfect scapegoat for society's anxieties. The working man's vocabulary was the new battleground of civilization. The irony, of course, was that the people most likely to swear were also those most likely to have legitimate reasons to. Dock workers, miners, sailors and factory hands lived hard, dangerous lives where a curse word was less an expression of vice and more a coping mechanism. When a boiler exploded or a coal cart tipped, "Oh, bother," didn't quite cover it. But the upper classes, ensconced in parlours and prayer books, declared that such language degraded the soul. The poor called it Tuesday. Police reports from the 19th century are filled with delicious absurdities. John Smith, labourer, charged with using profane language after striking his thumb with a hammer. Mary Brown, laundress, fined for obscene utterance when splashed by passing carriage. The word obscene was doing a lot of heavy lifting. It could mean anything from an actual curse to a mildly annoyed drat. The law's definition was flexible enough to criminalise emotion itself. Stub your toe, pay a shilling, swear twice, see you in court. The courts loved these cases because they were simple, visible and moralising. No messy evidence, no complex motivations, just a constable's word that someone had shouted, "Damn!" too loudly near a lamppost. Magistrates turned them into miniature morality plays. The accused was scolded, fined, and paraded as a warning to others. Newspapers printed the proceedings with glee, offering readers a double thrill. Public shame for the sinner and private enjoyment of the forbidden words, carefully censored, of course, with tasteful dashes. The obsession with improper language gave rise to a whole industry of linguistic self-defense. Pamphlets circulated teaching polite alternatives to profanity. Instead of bloody, one should say blessed. Instead of damn, try confound it. The Almighty was still invoked, just with better diction. Swearing was not to be eradicated, only rebranded. You could sin linguistically, as long as it sounded like you'd read Shakespeare first. And like most Victorian morality, the crackdown on the swearing was deeply classist. The same expressions that scandalised middle-class ears in the mouths of the poor became colourful wit. When used by gentlemen, aristocrats could get away with a casual "by Jove" or "damn the expense" because it came with silverware. The poor shouting the same words after a 16-hour shift were vulgar. Moral purity, it turned out, was a matter of accent. Women bore the harshest end of linguistic policing. Female offenders were treated as doubly fallen, violating both the law and femininity. A woman who swore was not just coarse but unnatural, a threat to the very idea of Victorian womanhood. Courts often described them as abandoned or depraved, as if profanity were the first step toward apocalypse. In one infamous case, a widow in Manchester was fined for using language unbecoming to her sex after yelling at a landlord who'd raised her rent. The words she used were never printed, but one suspects they were justified. Of course, all this moral panic ignored one small detail. The Victorians themselves swore constantly. Behind closed doors, in barracks, on ships, in pubs, and even in Parliament, the air was thick with expletives. Letters and diaries from the era show that profanity was alive and well, just discreetly quarantined away from public view. It wasn't about erasing vice. It was about hiding it behind lace curtains. Even the clergy struggled. Preachers routinely thundered about the language of the gutter, only to find that their congregations preferred sermons with a bit of rhetorical spice. Theologians debated whether saying "devil take it" counted as inviting damnation or merely bad manners. The line between sin and syntax grew so blurred that some churches installed language reform committees, spiritual proofreaders for the apocalypse. Yet in all this, there was a strange poetry. Swearing laws revealed the Victorian fear of expression itself. Emotion was dangerous. Anger, frustration, even pain had to be tamed into politeness. To curse was to lose control, and control was everything. The empire valued composure above honesty, dignity above truth. The ability to suppress a scream, swallow a swear, and smile through agony was seen as the mark of true civilization. and so swearing became rebellion. A whispered bloody hell in the wrong place was a miniature revolution against the empire of manners. The working classes kept cursing not because they lacked refinement, but because sometimes a good curse did more for the soul than a sermon ever could. In the end, the Victorians didn't eliminate profanity. They made it powerful. They turned language itself into a crime scene. Every word carried risk. Every outburst was evidence. The good news, the empire was civilized. The bad news, your toe still hurts and you're under arrest for saying so. If you ever woke up in Victorian Britain on a Sunday and thought, "I'll just relax today," congratulations. You were already breaking the law. The Victorians treated Sunday less as a day of rest and more as a nationwide performance review for your soul. Every hour was an exam, and the invigilator was God assisted by your neighbours, the police, and at least one overzealous church warden. The concept of the Sabbath wasn't new, of course, but the Victorians perfected it into a fine-tuned mechanism of guilt. The Lord's Day Observance Society, founded in 1831, decided that the best way to honour God was to make sure nobody else enjoyed themselves either. Work was banned, travel was discouraged, and entertainment, well, that was pure sin wrapped in melody. Joy was suspicious. Whistling was practically witchcraft. The goal, at least in theory, was moral purity. In practice, it was an exercise in collective misery. Shops were shuttered, pubs locked, theatres closed, and even museums dimmed their lights. Ordinary workers, those who finally had a single day off, were expected to spend it not relaxing but repenting. The Sabbath was less day of rest, a more mandatory spiritual performance review. Victorians believed that keeping Sunday sacred preserved the moral health of the nation. To do otherwise, reformers warned, would invite chaos, strikes, crime, atheism, possibly even France. The Lord's Day was civilization's firewall against temptation. A man who started by skipping church might, by evening, be dancing, gambling, or worst of all, laughing. The law reflected this paranoia. In many towns, local ordinances prohibited Sunday trade, Sunday amusements, and even Sunday travel. Street musicians could be fined for playing hymns too enthusiastically. Cab drivers were scolded for accepting fares. One enterprising London barber was jailed for cutting hair on the Sabbath, a clear affront to divine follicle regulation. You could, in theory, walk somewhere, but only if your face expressed the proper degree of repentance. Police officers, poor souls, had to enforce this spiritual curfew. A constable's Sunday beat often involved patrolling for signs of improper conduct. Laughter, whistling, or any movement faster than a solemn stroll. Arrests for Sabbath breaking included such heinous offences as buying a newspaper, washing a carriage, or, gasp, playing cricket. In 1864, one group of boys was fined for rolling hoops in the street. The magistrate called it a disturbance of the public peace. The boys called it Saturday in disguise. And yet hypocrisy ran deeper than a sermon's echo. The wealthy, as usual, managed to find holy loopholes. They could hire servants to do all the forbidden labour while still claiming piety. Cooking, cleaning, and carriage driving weren't work if someone else did them. In grand houses, the Sabbath was observed with the same rigour as a dinner party. Lavish meals, polite conversation, and absolutely no visible exertion from anyone who mattered. For the poor, however, Sunday was the one day they could have lived a little, and they weren't allowed to. Factories closed, wages paused, but rent didn't. Many working-class families lived week to week, yet were forbidden from buying or selling anything on the only day they had time to do so. The logic was impeccable. Poverty builds character. And if you could survive a Sunday without eating or smiling, you'd surely earn a moral medal in heaven. Even nature wasn't spared the sermon. Sunday recreation in the countryside became controversial. Picnics, boating, or strolling in parks were seen as signs of moral decay. In one infamous case, visitors to London's Hampstead Heath were harassed by reformers for public idleness. The crowd's great sin? Enjoying fresh air. Leafy green trees, apparently, were gateways to wickedness. But of all the forbidden activities, music suffered the cruelest fate. The Victorians adored hymns but distrusted melody. A church organ was fine, but a street fiddle was the devil's ringtone. Music halls, those rowdy temples of working-class laughter, were legally required to close on Sundays. Even private singing could invite disapproval. In Manchester, a man was fined for singing a sea shanty within earshot of a chapel. One imagines God somewhere above sighing, "I didn't ask for this." To the reformers, these rules weren't repression, they were compassion. They genuinely believed they were saving souls from the exhaustion of modern life. By resting, praying and reflecting, one could rejuvenate spiritually. But the reality was rather more grim. Thousands spent the day bored, hungry and half afraid of committing a misdemeanour by sneezing too cheerfully. There were rebels, of course. Sabbath breakers, as they were called, became minor folk heroes. London cabmen offered illegal rides to Hyde Park. Underground taverns quietly poured gin to those in need of spiritual refreshment. Some shopkeepers risked fines to sell bread or milk to starving families. The newspapers loved these stories, because nothing tickled the public like someone arrested for enjoying Sunday too much. By the late Victorian period, the Sabbath's iron grip began to loosen. Industrial life demanded more flexibility. And even the most devout reformers couldn't stop trains forever. Public opinion shifted. Museums reopened, libraries allowed visitors, and the Sunday walk became a socially acceptable loophole for the restless. But the stigma lingered. For decades, British life still carried that faint odour of sanctified boredom every weekend. The Sunday laws revealed something essential about the Victorian psyche. They feared not sin, but spontaneity. Order was sacred, joy was dangerous. To smile too freely, to whistle too loudly, to buy an apple at the wrong hour, all these acts whispered of rebellion. So yes, in Victorian Britain, you could work 6 days a week, starve 6 nights in a row, and still find yourself on trial come Sunday for existing incorrectly. The good news, Monday was coming. The bad news, you'd have to pretend you were grateful. Imagine strolling through a Victorian city, smog drifting through gaslit streets, carts clattering over cobblestones, and somewhere in the distance a voice begins to sing, perhaps a ballad about a tragic sailor or a comic tune about a drunk husband and his furious wife. For a brief moment, the grim industrial haze lifts. People smile, toss a coin and hum along. Then, inevitably, a constable appears, puffed with self-importance, and declares the singer under arrest. Welcome to Victorian Britain, where music in public was suspicious, and joy in public was borderline treason. The Victorians loved music, of course. They adored opera, chamber performances, and anything that came with an admission fee. But singing in the street, that was anarchy with a melody. As one magistrate famously declared, "Public song invites disorder." Translation, the wrong kind of people were enjoying themselves too loudly. Street singers, known as ballad mongers, were the social media influencers of the 19th century. They spread news, gossip, and entertainment faster than newspapers ever could. Their songs covered everything from royal scandals to sensational crimes. For the working class, they were the soundtrack of daily life. For the respectable elite, they were an audio nuisance with legs. By the mid-1800s, laws against public nuisance and obstruction gave police the power to silence street music almost at will. Officers were instructed to stop disturbing noise, a definition so elastic it could include singing, whistling, or even humming near a shopkeeper who didn't appreciate your key. The Metropolitan Police Acts were less about safety and more about sanitising the streets. The goal was to make cities sound as clean as they looked in respectable engravings, which is to say, unrealistically quiet. Many performers were poor women, widows or disabled veterans who sang to survive. The police called them disturbers of the peace. The public called them cheap entertainment. But for the moral reformers, street music was the devil's favourite chorus. They claimed it led to idleness, drunkenness, and, naturally, the collapse of civilization. Newspapers ran indignant letters from readers complaining that these wretched singers pollute the very air. The irony, the same readers likely wept over the latest tragic ballad once it appeared printed in a penny magazine. The hypocrisy was almost lyrical. Opera houses overflowed with wealthy Victorians swooning to Verdi and Puccini, yet the same people demanded the arrest of a barefoot girl singing the same tune outside for pennies. The difference, of course, was that one came with chandeliers and champagne and the other came with hunger. Victorians hated free concerts, unless they came with expensive tickets. The ballad trade itself was an art form. Singers bought printed sheets of lyrics from street printers, memorised them, and performed in markets, alleyways, and tavern entrances. Some were comic, some tragic, and some deliciously scandalous. Tales of elopements, murders, and royal misbehaviour that everyone pretended to disapprove of but secretly adored. Crowds would gather, coins would clink, and for a moment class barriers melted under the rhythm of rhyme. And that, more than anything, frightened the authorities. Music brought people together, and together people might start talking. The campaign to silence street music reached absurd heights in the 1850s and 60s, especially in London's wealthier districts. Clerks, lawyers and writers complained that they couldn't concentrate with songs drifting through their windows. One man claimed he lost 5 hours of productivity a day due to street ballads of appalling mediocrity. Another described the experience as sonic terrorism. The worst offender apparently was a man who sang Pop Goes the Weasel near Parliament for 6 straight hours, a performance that probably deserved at least some recognition for endurance. But behind the laughter lay cruelty. Arrests were frequent. Singers were fined sums far beyond what they earned, and failure to pay meant a trip to prison. In 1864, one London woman was sentenced to 14 days for persistent singing. 14 days for having a better sense of rhythm than her local magistrate. Many performers, especially women, faced additional humiliation. Courts described them as shameless and immodest, as though poverty plus melody was a moral failing. Not everyone supported the crackdown. Charles Dickens, always sympathetic to the sounds of the street, defended the singers in his essays, arguing that they brought life to an otherwise bleak city. He pointed out that the same people who complained about noise conveniently ignored the constant clatter of carriages, factory bells, and newsboys shouting headlines. What Victorians truly objected to wasn't the sound itself, it was who was making it. Even the clergy were divided. Some preachers condemned street music as sinful distraction. Others saw it as a chance for outreach. Evangelical groups began their own holy singing campaigns, flooding the streets with hymns to drown out the profane ditties. In some neighbourhoods, this led to literal musical turf wars, a hymn on one corner, a bawdy ballad on the other, and a constable somewhere in between trying to arrest both. Despite all efforts to silence them, street singers persisted. They adapted, shifted corners, and found sympathetic shopkeepers who let them perform under awnings. Their songs evolved with the times, from crime ballads to patriotic anthems, from laments about poverty to cheeky parodies of political figures. Each tune was a small act of rebellion against the empire of respectability. By the late Victorian era, the street song had become part of urban folklore. Music halls borrowed their style, and publishers made fortunes printing respectable versions of what began as illegal ditties. Society, as usual, stole from the very people it once arrested. The melodies that once earned jail time became the nostalgic soundtracks of the next generation. So if you'd been caught humming in 1860 London, you might have been hauled off for disturbing the peace. But don't worry, in a few decades your descendants' children would be buying sheet music of that very tune at Harrods. The good news, the music never really stopped. The bad news, the Victorians kept trying to fine it for existing. In Victorian Britain, few objects combined practicality and pretension quite like the umbrella. To the modern eye, it's a simple tool, a rain shield, a stick with aspirations. But in the 19th century, the umbrella was nothing less than a symbol of moral standing. It told the world you were civilized, respectable, and, most importantly, dry, which meant stealing one wasn't just petty theft, it was social assassination. The Victorians lived in an era where weather was both constant and personal. London, perpetually soaked in drizzle, required its citizens to arm themselves against the sky. But not just with any umbrella, oh no. Your umbrella said everything about who you were. Its material, handle, and even how you carried it communicated class. A gentleman's umbrella had a polished wooden shaft, perhaps with a silver tip or ivory crook, and was never, under any circumstances, shared. Lending it out would be as indecent as lending out one's toothbrush. So when umbrella theft became common, society panicked. Newspapers called it a national plague. Pamphlets warned of the umbrella thief in our midst, and one humorist claimed it was the most diabolical form of larceny since the Garden of Eden. The Theft of Umbrella Act never existed, but you wouldn't know that from the way courts treated it. In police reports, stolen umbrellas received more attention than stolen bread. After all, hunger was regrettable, but losing your umbrella was embarrassing. For the Victorians, embarrassment was worse than crime. Having your umbrella stolen in public implied carelessness, a moral weakness. Respectability was supposed to come with vigilance. A man who couldn't protect his umbrella clearly couldn't be trusted to protect his household or, heaven forbid, his reputation. Satirical magazines had a field day. Punt once joked that London's umbrella thieves were trained by Fagin and promoted by the weather. But make no mistake, the punishment was very real. Stealing an umbrella, especially from a gentleman, could result in imprisonment or transportation. Courts treated it as larceny of personal property, with sentences ranging from a few months' hard labour to several years abroad. One unfortunate thief in 1845 received 7 years' transportation to Tasmania for pinching an umbrella from a coffeehouse rack. It might sound absurd, but the logic was pure Victorian. If you can't trust a man with umbrellas, civilization collapses. Even more absurd was how seriously victims took it. Police stations regularly recorded lost umbrella reports that read like love letters. A fine silk umbrella, black, with bone handle, much prized. Umbrella of superior make, family heirloom, great sentimental value. Losing one was practically a bereavement. Gentlemen even engraved their initials on the handles, and by mid-century London boasted entire shops dedicated to umbrella engraving and recovery. The paranoia spawned a new profession: umbrella detectives. Yes, you could hire someone to track down your missing parasol. These detectives scoured pawn shops and second-hand stalls, interrogated street hawkers, and occasionally bribed cab drivers for tips. If successful, they returned the umbrella, usually for a fee higher than the umbrella's worth. But for the proud owner, dignity was priceless. Then there were the accidental criminals and people who borrowed umbrellas from restaurants or train stations, meaning to return them but forgetting. Victorians called it umbrella absent-mindedness, and it became such a social epidemic that essays were written to defend it. One famous piece, titled Confessions of an Umbrella Borrower, argued that the act wasn't theft but meteorological necessity. The author claimed, "A sudden storm excuses all moral hesitation." The law disagreed. Judges were far less poetic about rain-induced kleptomania. Women too were deeply entangled in umbrella politics. For ladies, parasols were the summer equivalent, delicate, lacy, and entirely useless against rain but indispensable for status. Having it stolen wasn't about weather protection, it was about virtue. A missing parasol suggested recklessness. "A lady who loses her parasol," sniffed one etiquette manual, "invites gossip." In a society where reputation was armour, a misplaced umbrella could pierce it clean through. Umbrellas also crossed class lines in fascinating ways. The working class carried cheaper versions, thick wooden-handled monstrosities that could double as walking sticks or makeshift weapons, and indeed they often did. Street fights occasionally involved umbrellas, with police records noting assaults conducted with said object in hand. An umbrella wasn't just a rain protector, it was an all-purpose badge of respectability and self-defence. Theft rings specialising in umbrellas became a genuine problem. In major cities like London, Liverpool and Manchester, gangs targeted cafes, churches and omnibus stations. They'd swipe umbrellas during storms, sell them in second-hand markets and vanish before the rain cleared. Newspapers published sensational headlines like, Umbrella leaves working, as though the perpetrators were masterminds rather than damp opportunists. Entrepreneurs, as always, found a way to profit from the panic. Shops began to selling anti-theft umbrellas with hidden initials, unique engravings, or patented locking handles. One inventor even proposed an umbrella that fired an alarm if opened by the wrong person, essentially a Victorian car alarm for your rain gear. Sadly, most people preferred the classic method, glaring suspiciously at everyone holding a similar umbrella. The umbrella's symbolism lingered far beyond the drizzle. It came to represent control, discipline, and composure, the very qualities Victorians worshipped. An upright man kept his umbrella straight, a dishevelled one let it drip. So stealing it wasn't just theft, it was a metaphorical stripping of identity. Take a man's umbrella and you've basically robbed his dignity. By the twilight of the century, the obsession began to fade, replaced by more pressing crimes, forgery, fraud, and the occasional act of empire building. But the umbrella's reign as moral artifact left a lasting drizzle in history's memory. Even today, an umbrella left in a restaurant still causes that moment of panic, that Victorian whisper, "Don't be careless, civilization depends on it." The good news, the British learned to mass-produce umbrellas. The bad news, they never stopped taking them personally. If you think modern society is obsessed with gossip, the Victorians would like a word, preferably whispered through a lace fan. In a world that prized appearances above all else, reputation was currency, and gossip was both the stock market and the weapon that crashed it. Talking about someone could ruin them, but talking about someone publicly, that could ruin you. Victorian Britain was a civilization addicted to its own moral reflection. Respectability wasn't just a virtue, it was a full-time job. The moment you left your house, you were auditioning for social survival. But behind every polite good morning lurked a blood sport of speculation. Who was sleeping where? Who'd been seen at whose house after dark? Who'd fainted a little too dramatically at church? Everyone gossiped, everyone. But the trick was to do it quietly enough that you couldn't be sued for it. And that's not an exaggeration. Gossip wasn't just frowned upon, it could land you in court. The 19th century saw an explosion of defamation, slander, and libel cases, as fragile reputations collided with a society that treated rumour as public entertainment. Britain's newspapers were the social media of their day, columns filled with anonymous letters hinting at scandal. One particularly vicious report could unravel marriages, end careers, or even exile someone from polite society. The only way to survive the rumour mill was to sue it. Victorians sued over everything. A hint of infidelity, a whispered comment at a dinner party, a misprinted name in a gossip column. One famous case involved a lady who took offence at being described as of a certain age. The court didn't just award her damages, it declared the phrase a malicious falsehood. Another man sued after being called ungentlemanly. The judge ruled that the statement strikes at the heart of British manhood. The fine, 100, enough to buy several fine umbrellas and a lifetime of smugness. The irony, of course, was that gossip itself powered the entire social machine. It was how people navigated the labyrinth of class and morality. Without gossip, how could anyone know who was respectable, who was rising, and who was on the decline? In drawing rooms, gossip was the social currency of intimacy, shared over tea sweetened with malice. But in public, it was toxic contraband. Victorians loved gossip. They just preferred it behind closed mahogany doors. To control the chaos, polite society developed a set of unspoken rules, the etiquette of insinuation. One could imply, suggest, or delicately allude, but never outright state. Instead of saying Lady Fortescue ran off with her coachman, one might remark, Lady Fortescue has taken quite a fondness for the open road. The meaning was clear. The lawsuit was avoided. It was a linguistic ballet of cowardice and creativity. The press perfected this art of deniable mischief. The society pages of newspapers and magazines like the Illustrated London News and the tatler, printed gossip as alleged anecdotes, always wrapped in plausible innocence. A certain noble lord, an unnamed lady of distinction, or a prominent figure in the arts. Everyone knew who they meant, but legally, nobody did. The entire upper class read these lines with the same guilty pleasure people now reserve for celebrity gossip columns. But the danger wasn't confined to print. Ordinary people, servants, shopkeepers, clerks, could also find themselves punished for idle talk. Servants in particular were caught in a moral double bind. They saw and heard everything, but discussing it was grounds for dismissal or arrest. In one notorious case, a maid was prosecuted for repeating a rumour that her employer's son had entertained a lady of low reputation. The boy's reputation survived, the maid's didn't. Even whispering about someone's finances could bring legal ruin. To suggest that a businessman was unsound or untrustworthy could sink his credit overnight. Courts treated commercial gossip as a direct assault on the empire's economic morality. After all, what was Britain built on, if not polite fictions and mutual pretense? And then there was the gender divide. For women, gossip was both empowerment and peril. A woman who spread rumours was vindictive. A man who did it was politically informed. Yet gossip was often one of the few tools women had to navigate their restricted social world. It was the weapon of the powerless, a whisper that could shift alliances or topple hypocrisy. But if caught, the punishment was severe. Newspapers loved to describe slanderous women as if they were wild animals. Judges lectured them about the moral decay of idle tongues. Because naturally, nothing said moral superiority like publicly humiliating someone for speaking in private. The religious establishment also got involved, because of course it did. Clergymen condemned gossip from the pulpit as the devil's telephone. Sermons warned that idle words were sins that could stain the immortal soul. Yet churchgoers were often the worst offenders, congregations buzzing with speculation before the sermon even began. One preacher complained that his parishioners gossiped about who sinned while I was still describing the sin. By the late Victorian era, gossip had become both more dangerous and more institutionalised. The press grew bolder, feeding a public hunger for scandal. High-profile trials, adulterous duchesses, fraudulent vicars, bankrupt MPs, turned private sins into national theatre. Everyone condemned the spectacle and everyone read every word. The moral outrage was half the fun. In the end, gossip wasn't just a pastime. It was the nervous system of Victorian society. It sustained hierarchies, enforced morality, and gave everyone, rich or poor, something to talk about besides the weather and mortality rates. But it also revealed the fragility of a world built entirely on appearances. When your reputation was everything, words were weapons, and even a whisper could kill. So if you lived in Victorian Britain, you could commit the ultimate crime without ever lifting a finger or stealing a loaf of bread, just by saying, "Did you hear about Mrs. So-and-so?" And if the wrong person heard you, the next headline might be about you. The good news? You were part of the social conversation. The bad news? So was your lawyer. In the grand theatre of Victorian morality, few crimes so perfectly revealed the era's obsession with appearances as cross-dressing, the act of wearing clothes not assigned to your birth gender. To us, it might sound like fashion freedom. To the Victorians, it was practically an earthquake in a petticoat. They treated it not as a wardrobe choice, but as a moral emergency. This was, after all, a society built on the strict choreography of gender. Men strutted about in waistcoats and moral authority, while women floated through parlours in corsets and submission. Clothing was not simply fabric, it was social architecture. Every stitch reinforced the empire's favourite illusion, that the world ran on divine order, with men leading, women obeying, and everyone suffocating politely in the process. So that when someone blurred that visual code, when a woman wore trousers or a man dared to don a dress, it was like telling the empire that God had bad handwriting. The legal system wasted no time stepping in. Although there wasn't a specific anti-cross-dressing act, The police had a buffet of vague laws to choose from: disorderly conduct and public indecency, impersonation, and the ever-popular intent to deceive. These elastic charges could be stretched to fit any situation, especially if the accused's outfit made the constable uncomfortable. Fashion crime? Only if your trousers were too convincing. For women, the motivations were often painfully practical. A society that barred them from most jobs, schools, and freedoms also punished them for trying to survive. Some women dressed as men to work in factories, serve in the army, or simply walk home at night without harassment. Yet if caught, they faced arrest and public shaming. Court records describe bewildered women explaining themselves to judges: "I needed work, sir," or "I needed safety." The magistrate's response usually involved a fine, a moral lecture, and a reminder that poverty was preferable to trousers. One of the most famous cases was Mary Walker, an American doctor and reformer who scandalized polite society by wearing men's suits. Though she wasn't British, her notoriety rippled across the Atlantic, igniting fierce debate in London papers. Was she insane, immoral, or, as one humorist put it, merely overdressed for her gender? British women who followed her example were branded Amazons or unsexed females, which in Victorian terms was just one polite adjective short of witchcraft. Men who cross-dressed were treated even more harshly. Their crime wasn't just a matter of fashion, it was seen as an assault on masculinity itself. In a world where manhood was defined by dominance and moral restraint, appearing feminine was social heresy. Police raids on music halls, private clubs, and masquerade balls regularly turned up men in gowns and makeup, promptly dragged before the courts as persons of perverse tendency. In the mid-19th century, London's underground queer scene became the target of constant surveillance. The most notorious example was the 1870s Bolton and Park case, involving two young men, Frederick Park and Ernest Bolton, who performed on stage in women's clothing under the names Fanny and Stella. They were flamboyant, theatrical, and unapologetically fabulous, which made them irresistible to both audiences and the police. After being followed for weeks, the two were arrested outside a London theatre, charged with conspiring to commit unnatural offences. Their trial became a national sensation. Newspapers described their gowns, jewellery and mannerisms in lurid detail, feigning outrage while feeding readers exactly what they wanted: scandal with sequins. Ultimately, Bolton and Park were acquitted, but not before enduring invasive medical examinations and months of public ridicule. The case left a permanent stain on Victorian morality, a reminder that the line between entertainment and persecution was thinner than a corset string. Behind all the moral panic was fear, not of fashion, but of fluidity. The Victorians clung to the idea that gender roles were sacred pillars of the social order. If a woman could wear trousers, what next? She might vote, she might earn money, she might even, heaven forbid, make decisions. And if a man could wear a dress, what did that say about the divine hierarchy of strength and control? The entire structure of civilization might unravel faster than a cheap hem. Religious leaders declared cross-dressing an abomination. Doctors, always eager to pathologize what they didn't understand, labeled it a symptom of moral insanity. Some claimed it stemmed from disordered nerves. Others, more inventive, argued that it was caused by tight corsets confusing the brain's gender sense. Medical journals filled with alarmed essays about men overcome by the delusion of womanhood. To be clear, the 19th century cure for gender nonconformity was usually prison or humiliation. Yet beneath the surface, cross-dressing flourished in private spaces. Masquerade balls, carnivals, and theatre stages became havens for experimentation. The stage, in particular, provided legal camouflage. Since Shakespeare's day, men playing women was a theatrical tradition, one the Victorians tolerated as long as it stayed within proscenium boundaries. In music halls, comedic pantomime dames and principal boys, young women playing heroic male roles, drew roaring crowds. Society laughed, but only because it was pretend. Outside the theatre, it was still criminal. The hypocrisy was, as always, immaculate. The same gentlemen who condemned deviant attire in Parliament cheered men in wigs and corsets on stage. The same newspapers that called female cross-dressers unnatural published sketches of them with voyeuristic delight. Victorian morality, it turned out, had a flexible dress code, provided the ticket price was high enough. By the end of the century, a few reformers began to challenge this madness. Feminists like Rosa Bonheur, a French painter known for wearing men's clothes, with special police permission, no less, inspired quiet admiration among progressive women in Britain. Her rationale was simple: "I cannot paint horses in a crinoline." It was a sentence so rational it bordered on revolutionary. But for most Victorians, gender was destiny stitched into cloth. To blur that line was to risk exile from polite society, or worse, the courtroom. Cross-dressing exposed the fragility of a culture that measured morality by outfit. If virtue had a hemline, then sin was just a different cut. The good news, fashion eventually moved on. The bad news, Victorian law didn't. Of all the bizarre contradictions in Victorian Britain, none was quite as cruelly ironic as how it treated the poor for the crime of being visibly poor. Begging, the final act of desperation, wasn't seen as a symptom of hardship or misfortune. It was a criminal offence, a moral failure wrapped in rags. If you were starving, destitute, and out of options, the Empire's official response was simple: need money? Perfect, you'll get a fine. Victorian society loved to talk about charity, but only from a safe distance. Charity was something you did, not something you needed. Middle-class reformers could pen sentimental essays about the deserving poor while stepping over an actual beggar on the pavement. To them, poverty was a social inconvenience, not a societal failure. The beggar didn't inspire compassion. They ruined the aesthetic of progress. The legal hammer fell hardest through the Vagrancy Acts, a series of laws originally designed to deal with rogues and vagabonds. By the 19th century, those categories had expanded to include almost anyone down on their luck. The act of asking for help, even polite, could get you arrested. Police were empowered to remove any person wandering abroad and begging, as if poverty were contagious. The punishment? Imprisonment with hard labour followed by release into the same hunger that caused it. The courts viewed beggars not as victims, but as liars. They believed that every person who asked for alms was secretly a professional con artist, living in luxury behind the facade of misery. Newspapers eagerly fed this fantasy with sensational headlines like "The Well-Fed Imposter" and "The False Cripple of Clerkenwell." One story told of a man who pretended to be blind by day, only to be caught reading a newspaper at night. Whether true or not, such tales justified the ongoing war against anyone who dared to look desperate. And make no mistake, it was a war, one waged in the name of moral hygiene. Victorians believed that visible poverty spread unrest. The sight of a beggar outside a shop full of luxury goods was a moral embarrassment, a reminder that the Empire's wealth wasn't shared equally. So rather than fix the problem, they criminalised the reminder. Out of sight, out of conscience. The Metropolitan Police were eager enforcers. Constables regularly swept the streets, rounding up beggars like stray dogs. Official reports recorded arrests for obstructing foot traffic, annoying passers-by, or the wonderfully vague importuning. Even children weren't spared. Orphaned or abandoned youngsters, often reduced to asking for scraps, were hauled before magistrates as juvenile delinquents. Their crime? Starving too publicly. In one infamous case, an 80-year-old boy was sentenced to a reform school for begging bread, and the magistrate explained that such mercy would teach him the dignity of honest work. What work an 8-year-old without parents was supposed to find, he didn't specify. For the Victorians, poverty wasn't just an economic condition, it was a character flaw that needed correcting through punishment. To make matters worse, public sympathy was deliberately suppressed. Reformers, in their infinite self-assurance, declared that giving to beggars encouraged vice. Philanthropy was to be systematised, channeled through respectable charities, not handed directly to the poor. If someone was starving on the street, the correct moral procedure was to report them to the authorities, not feed them. Private generosity became a public sin, and thus the workhouse system grew fat on misery. Those arrested for begging were often sent there as reform candidates. Inside, life was a carefully designed humiliation. Families separated, food rationed, and labour endless. The idea was that suffering would inspire gratitude. The workhouse, one official proudly claimed, is not a prison, but the honest poor will wish it were. Meanwhile, street life was a battlefield. Beggars developed ingenious strategies to survive without crossing the line from pitiful to criminal. Some disguised themselves as musicians, selling sheet songs or performing for pennies. Others offered flowers, shoe shines, or trinkets, and anything that could transform a plea into a service. The most creative pretended to sell matches or lavender, tiny tokens of trade that let them avoid the dreaded label of beggar. But even these thin veils of dignity were fragile. Police often accused street vendors of begging under false pretenses. The law drew no distinction between entrepreneurship and desperation. The message was clear. If you were poor, there was no correct way to exist. The middle class, of course, loved to moralise about it. They published guides on how to recognise the fraudulent beggar. Helpful advice like, never give to anyone who looks too healthy, or genuine poverty is rarely vocal. For a society obsessed with decency, they showed a remarkable talent for cruelty disguised as prudence. And yet, despite all the repression, begging never disappeared. It couldn't. The economic system that produced it, unstable labour, industrial injury, overcrowded housing, ensured a steady supply of the desperate. Every crackdown just shifted the problem elsewhere. From the streets to the prisons, from the prisons to the workhouses, and finally back to the streets again. The war on begging wasn't a solution. It was a loop, till the Victorians convinced themselves they were winning. Politicians congratulated the police for cleansing the streets. Newspapers celebrated declining numbers of visible mendicants. What they didn't count were the invisible ones, those dying quietly in slums, crushed under the moral weight of respectability. It's tempting to laugh at the absurdity of fining the penniless, but it captures the heart of Victorian logic. Morality mattered more than mercy. A clean conscience was more important than a full stomach. And so the empire carried on, building monuments to virtue while jailing the hungry. The good news? The law promised redemption for every sinner. The bad news? It cost more than a beggar could pay. Victorian Britain was a nation that prided itself on order, a land where every street had a constable, every virtue had a manual, and every outburst of public emotion was treated like an act of rebellion. Which is why, when hunger began to boil over into protest, the government's response was not empathy, but outrage. The working poor might have been starving, but if they dared to complain too loudly, or worse, threw something through a window, they were instantly rebranded from victims to villains. You could starve quietly or riot loudly. Both earned jail time. The Industrial Revolution had built cities that glittered with progress while hiding their misery behind smoke. Wages stagnated, food prices soared, and unemployment turned whole districts into ticking time bombs of frustration. Bread, the most basic staple, became a daily gamble. For the working class, it wasn't just food, it was survival itself. So when a bad harvest or greedy miller sent the price skyward, the reaction wasn't polite petitions, it was riot season. Bread riots weren't new, but in Victorian Britain they took on a distinctly moral flavour. Protesters weren't just hungry, they were offended. They felt betrayed by a society that preached Christian charity while leaving them to starve beside overflowing markets. In towns from Bristol to Manchester, crowds gathered shouting, "Fair price for the poor!" They weren't anarchists or thieves. They were desperate families demanding justice in the only language the powerful seemed to hear: noise. The authorities, predictably, heard something else entirely: sedition. A mob, to Victorian officials, was a contagious disease of the lower classes. Local magistrates called in soldiers. and police forces were ordered to disperse gatherings by necessary means, which usually meant clubs, sabres, and a deep misunderstanding of economics. The newspapers, ever eager to uphold social hierarchy, painted the rioters as dangerous agitators rather than starving citizens. The word hunger rarely appeared. Lawlessness did. Window smashing became the signature move of these uprisings. Shops that refused to lower bread prices found their display glass redecorated with rocks. It wasn't random vandalism, it was targeted symbolism. A smashed window said, "We see you. We see the food we can't afford." It was a protest written in shattering sound. But the courts didn't interpret poetry, they interpreted property damage. A single broken pane could mean months in prison. Women in particular were often at the front lines. They were the ones managing impossible household budgets, watching their children waste away while bakers doubled prices. When men hesitated to riot, women picked up stones. One contemporary account described a mob of wives in Liverpool attacking grain carts and shouting, "We'll have bread or blood," a slogan that would have made any reformer spill their tea. Magistrates called them hysterical. Historians now call them the first wave of working-class female activists. The state, however, had no patience for nuance. These women were arrested for vandalism, obstruction, or the ever-useful riotous assembly. In court, they were portrayed as unnatural, their very defiance seen as proof of moral decay. A good woman, the papers reminded readers, endured hunger softly. A bad one threw flour at the mayor. Guess which made better headlines. The Riot Act, originally written in 1714, was still very much alive. Authorities would read it aloud to crowds, a kind of ceremonial warning that essentially said, "You have 1 hour to stop being angry or we'll start shooting." Unsurprisingly, that seldom calmed anyone down. In several instances, soldiers fired into crowds, leaving bodies in the streets beside the bread they couldn't afford. The official reports described such tragedies as restoration of peace. Despite the brutality, the riots revealed cracks in the empire's moral facade. How could a nation that boasted of progress and piety explain starving workers in the shadow of its factories? The press tried to spin it as the fault of agitators, but many onlookers began to sympathise. Some wealthy citizens even joined in relief efforts, organising soup kitchens and charitable bakeries. Of course, these were temporary salves, not cures. When the soup ran out, the hunger and the rage returned. One of the strangest episodes came during the Rebecca riots in Wales, 1839 to 1843, when farmers and labourers disguised themselves as women to protest tolls that raised food prices. Wearing dresses and calling themselves Rebecca and her daughters, they smashed toll gates and sang hymns while evading the police. It was rebellion with a sense of theatre and a sharp jab at gendered hypocrisy. The authorities naturally were appalled. Cross-dressing and destruction? Victorian sensibilities nearly fainted. Over time, window smashing evolved from spontaneous outrage into political strategy. Suffragettes, trade unionists, and socialist groups all borrowed the tactic, transforming it from hunger protest to statement of principle. But in the 1840s and 1850s, it remained an act of survival. The physical punctuation mark on a plea ignored too long. In court, defendants rarely denied their actions. One woman famously told the judge, "I broke the window because my children's ribs were showing." Another man shouted, "I'll take your sentence if you'll take my hunger." These weren't anarchists, they were philosophers with empty stomachs. The judges didn't appreciate the nuance. The punishment for riotous conduct could include months of hard labour or transportation overseas. The irony, of course, was that many of those transported found themselves working on colonial farms where food was plentiful, a grimly poetic form of state-sponsored relocation therapy. The empire couldn't feed its poor, but it could certainly ship them off somewhere with better soil. As the 19th century progressed, reform slowly crept in. New poor laws and food relief programs emerged, though never enough to end the cycle. Hunger remained a quiet epidemic and protest remained a punishable offence. but the window smashers left a legacy, proof that beneath the prim veneer of Victorian restraint beat a heart capable of rage, resistance, and the occasional well-aimed brick. The good news, they forced the empire to admit its own cruelty. The bad news, they had to break glass to be heard. If there's one thing the Victorians loved more than moral order, it was financial order, preferably enforced by law and paperwork. And few things combined both quite as neatly as the dog tax. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and regulation, even your pet wasn't safe from bureaucracy. Owning a dog was fine, loving it without paying tax was treason. The idea came from a deep national panic about rabies, or as Victorians called it, hydrophobia, a name that sounded more like a Greek tragedy than a medical diagnosis. In the 1790s, Britain introduced a tax on dogs to limit their numbers, but by the Victorian era it had evolved into something much larger, a test of respectability. A licensed dog meant you were a responsible citizen, an unlicensed one meant you were probably a criminal or worse, sentimental. By mid-century, every dog required an annual tax payment, 10 shillings, later adjusted by region. The receipt came in the form of a dog licence which had to be produced on demand. The law technically applied to everyone, but, as with most Victorian inventions, it mostly targeted the poor. Wealthy families could pay easily, working-class owners could not. But love, unfortunately for bureaucrats, doesn't check income brackets. For every polished gentleman's spaniel there were 10 ragged mutts belonging to dock workers, widows, and street children, none of whom could afford to make their affection official. The government treated this unlicensed affection as an epidemic of anarchy. Police were empowered to seize any dog found without proper documentation. Dog catchers, a new and deeply unpopular profession, roamed towns with nets and clubs, rounding up strays and suspected tax dodgers. It was the golden age of canine bureaucracy, thousands of dogs jailed, fined, or destroyed in the name of civic order. One newspaper cheerfully described these patrols as necessary cleansing, a phrase that might have made even Dickens throw down his pen in despair. The cruelty was often absurd. Dogs without collars were assumed to be untaxed and therefore illegal. Street children, unable to pay, sometimes scratched fake licenses onto tin discs or carved their names into bits of wood to hang from their pets' necks. It didn't fool anyone, but it showed a fierce kind of loyalty, proof that love could, at least briefly, outwit bureaucracy. There were reports of families pawning possessions to keep their dogs safe from the inspector. Some even hid them indoors during daylight hours, turning homes into underground shelters for illicit terriers. For the authorities, this was an outrage. Editorials thundered that lawless affection for animals endangers society. Reformers called unlicensed owners a menace to decency. The idea that the poor might value companionship more than obedience to paperwork struck at the heart of Victorian morality. Owning a dog without a license wasn't about evading tax. It was about defying the invisible wall that separated respectable from reckless. The law also revealed how Victorians saw animals not as companions but as moral barometers. A gentleman's dog symbolised control, loyalty and restraint, all qualities the empire adored. But a poor man's dog symbolised idleness, indulgence and chaos. In the middle-class imagination, the working-class dog was a barker, a biter, a beast that refused to know its place. Its master, by extension, was no better. Then there was the rabies hysteria. Every few years, newspapers erupted with stories of mad dogs terrorising the public. Never mind that the number of cases was vanishingly small, the panic was profitable. Municipalities could justify new regulations, new fines, and new patrols. By the 1860s, anti-rabies measures included muzzles, another moral accessory. A muzzled dog was a good dog, an unmuzzled one was practically a revolutionary. The same logic applied to their owners. Some Victorians fought back with satire. Pamphlets mocked the idea of licensing affection. "Shall the next tax be on breathing?" one writer asked. Others pointed out the hypocrisy. The government taxed dogs to protect public health, while factories choked entire neighbourhoods with smog. As usual, It was easier to control pets than progress. The courts were merciless. Magistrates routinely fined owners who couldn't produce a license, often more than the tax itself. Those unable to pay faced short jail terms. In one recorded case, a man was sentenced to 7 days for harbouring an unlicensed mongrel of no apparent value. The irony was rich. He was punished not for cruelty, but for kindness. Victorian justice was, in essence, a loyalty test disguised as law. Women often suffered most from these prosecutions. For widows or working-class mothers, dogs provided both protection and companionship. Yet the courts treated them with the same suspicion they reserved for beggars, too emotional, too sentimental, and too disobedient to the system. A woman with a dog but without means, one magistrate sniffed, betrays a disordered sense of duty. In other words, affection needed a receipt. The public's frustration grew so intense that it occasionally boiled over into outright defiance. In 1871, when Parliament introduced a new dog muzzling order, riots broke out in several towns. Crowds tore off their dogs' muzzles, shouting that "our pets are not prisoners." The authorities called it rabble insolence. History calls it the first known protest in defence of canine civil rights. By the end of the century, enforcement began to ease. The tax remained, but police had bigger problems, namely everything else about urban life. Still, the stigma lingered. A licensed dog remained a badge of social virtue, an unlicensed one, a sign of moral looseness. Even into the early 1900s, children taunted each other with the insult, "Your dog's not paid for," a perfectly Victorian mixture of cruelty and paperwork. The dog tax eventually became a relic, quietly abolished in the 20th century, when it turned out that love couldn't be itemised. But for a long, damp, bureaucratic century, Britain genuinely believed it could tax affection into respectability. The good news, Victorians loved their dogs. The bad news, the Treasury loved them more. Victorian Britain, the only place where holding hands could be seen as an act of rebellion, and a stolen kiss might require legal representation. The empire may have conquered half the globe, but heaven forbid anyone conquer their natural human urges within eyesight of the general public. For the Victorians, love was not a private emotion or a public celebration. It was a disciplinary issue. Public affection wasn't considered sweet. It was classified somewhere between scandal and sedition. The laws against public indecency were notoriously vague, which made them perfect tools for moral policing. Under the Town Police Clauses Act of 1847, anyone behaving in a way deemed indecent or offensive to public decorum could be fined or arrested. Indecent, of course, could mean anything from drunkenly shouting to glancing too warmly at someone across a park bench. It was the golden age of plausible morality. Victorian PDA meant prepare for detainment affectionately. Society didn't need much encouragement to enforce these standards. Respectability was a spectator sport, and nothing drew a crowd faster than the sight of two people violating the invisible code of propriety. Couples who dared to show affection in public, a brief kiss, an arm around the waist, or even a whisper deemed too intimate, were at risk of becoming the day's moral entertainment. Newspapers gleefully reported arrests for unseemly conduct, describing the details with the kind of voyeuristic flourish that suggested they enjoyed every sinful syllable. Part of the anxiety stemmed from the Victorian belief that emotion itself needed containment. The British elite defined civilization as the art of not showing what you felt. Passion, affection, even laughter in the wrong context, these were signs of moral weakness. Physical intimacy was reserved for marriage, and marriage was best implied, not seen. Love was fine as long as it was invisible, like plumbing, necessary but never discussed. The paradox was everywhere. The same society that wrote swooning love poetry, published romance novels, and painted cherubs on every available surface also considered public tenderness a threat to national virtue. The line between courtship and corruption was razor thin. A man tipping his hat too eagerly to a lady could be labelled forward. A woman returning a smile could be accused of inviting attention. Etiquette manuals helpfully instructed women to keep their gaze lowered and their expressions neutral, lest they inflame unworthy imaginations. In other words, flirtation was a felony of the face. This public suspicion of affection hit women especially hard. Female respectability depended on the appearance of purity, and one wrong move, or worse, one wrong rumour, could destroy a reputation overnight. A woman seen holding hands with a man outside wedlock risked being labelled loose. In some cases, magistrates genuinely treated it as evidence of prostitution. Police, ever zealous in defending public morality, patrolled parks and promenades looking for inappropriate coupling. The irony? Married couples were occasionally arrested too, simply because they looked too happy. The parks were particular battlegrounds of love and law. London's Hyde Park and Regent's Park became prime locations for romantic strolls, and thus prime targets for moral enforcement. Constables lurked behind hedges, ready to pounce on anyone caught embracing. One widely publicised case from 1867 involved a young couple fined 5 shillings for indecorous behaviour on a public bench. Their crime? Sitting too close. When the man protested that they were engaged, the magistrate replied dryly, "Then, sir, you may sit close after the ceremony." The moral panic over street flirting reached absurd heights. The Metropolitan Police even established undercover patrols to monitor promenades, particularly during holidays and fairs, when people were most likely to commit the terrible sin of enjoying themselves. These officers, usually humorless men in bowler hats, reported couples for anything from fond gazes to lingering conversation. One can only imagine how thrilling their reports must have been. Subject, lingering detected, immediate removal recommended, and heaven help you if your affection crossed class lines. A servant caught flirting with her employer's son, or a factory girl seen walking arm in arm with a gentleman, risked not just social disgrace but arrest. Improper association was treated as both moral contamination and potential scandal. The rich, of course, were never prosecuted. Their improprieties were called affairs. The poor were called offences. Even married couples weren't safe from the culture of repression. Public displays of marital affection were considered indecent, as though love expired at the church altar. Wives were expected to appear modest and restrained at all times. Husbands were expected to treat them like well-trained furniture. Victorian romance lived behind curtains in letters sealed with wax and regret. If one wished to demonstrate affection in public, the only socially acceptable option was to adopt a small dog and pet it solemnly. Yet for all their prudishness, the Victorians couldn't stop writing, painting and fantasizing about love. The more they outlawed physical expression, the more it erupted in art and literature. Sensational novels, Lady Audley's Secret, East Lynne, and dozens more, explored forbidden passions that would have scandalised the same readers in real life. Artists like Lawrence Alma Tadema painted scenes of lovers in classical settings, safely distanced by 2,000 years in a toga. Passion was fine as long as it was happening to ancient Romans. Of course, not everyone obeyed the rules. Lovers found ways to outwit the watchful eyes. Hidden corners of parks, discreet carriages, and conveniently timed fogs became the unofficial allies of Victorian romance. In seaside towns, young couples used bathing machines, those absurd wheeled huts meant to preserve modesty, as temporary hideaways for less than modest exchanges. One could almost imagine the nation's moral guardians fainting in unison at the thought. The real tragedy of these laws wasn't just their absurdity, but their effect. They taught generations to associate affection with shame. To hold hands was to invite judgment. To kiss was to risk scandal. Love became something to conceal rather than celebrate. For a society that claimed to worship virtue, it had a very peculiar fear of happiness. So if you were in Victorian Britain and found yourself falling in love, tread carefully. Court slowly, glance sparingly, and never ever let your lips meet in public, unless you enjoy the aesthetic of handcuffs. The good news, love conquers all. The bad news? In 19th century London, so did the local magistrate. If there was one thing that truly terrified Victorian Britain, it wasn't revolution, plague, or even French fashion trends. It was the possibility that someone, somewhere, might be enjoying themselves unsupervised. Nothing unsettled the empire's moral guardians quite like spontaneous fun. To them, laughter was suspicious, music was dangerous, and dancing in public was practically the prelude to the apocalypse. Victorians believed fun was a gateway drug to chaos. The 19th century was supposed to be the golden age of progress, but for many, it was also the golden age of boredom enforced by law. The government, the clergy, and the middle class joined forces to wage a quiet war on joy. Public amusements, fairs, carnivals, street games, circuses, and even spontaneous dancing were targeted as moral hazards, capable of turning honest citizens into godless degenerates. The logic was simple. If it made people smile, it was probably unwholesome. The crackdown began with the Fairs Act of 1840, a piece of legislation that sounds harmless until you realise it gave local authorities the power to shut down any gathering deemed riotous or indecent. Since indecent was Victorian for visible fun, nearly every fair in Britain qualified. Long-standing festivals that had once marked harvests, saints' days, or simple community gatherings were abruptly cancelled or heavily policed. Bonfires, dancing, and street music were replaced by sermons and stern frowns. The justifications were always dressed in virtue. Reformers claimed that fairs led to drunkenness, gambling, and loose behaviour, as though the average villager couldn't be trusted near a Ferris wheel without committing a felony. Clergymen thundered from pulpits about the corruption of the Midway, insisting that honest Christians should spend their leisure hours reading scripture, not throwing coconuts or winning stuffed animals. One particularly severe bishop declared that fairs were the devil's harvest, which was a bit dramatic for an event that mostly involved pie contests and brass bands. Yet beneath all this moral rhetoric lay something simpler: class control. Public amusements brought people together across social boundaries: workers, servants, farmers, and occasionally the odd curious aristocrat. They mixed freely, laughed loudly, and momentarily forgot their proper place. That kind of mingling terrified the Victorian establishment. Laughter was the great equaliser, and equality was the one joke they didn't find funny. The police soon became the enforcers of enforced dullness. Officers patrolled fairgrounds, confiscating dice, breaking up dances, and hauling away street performers for causing obstruction. In London, constables routinely cleared crowds from jugglers, puppet shows, and acrobats. Even innocent games like hoop rolling and skittles were banned in some neighbourhoods for inviting disorder. Imagine being arrested for knocking over wooden pins and realising history would later call it the Age of Reason. Street children, naturally, were prime targets. They had the audacity to play games, marbles, hopscotch, leapfrog, without government approval. Police called it idleness. Newspapers called it juvenile degeneracy. Reformers tutted that children should be indoors cultivating moral improvement. One London magistrate even sentenced a group of boys to a reform school for riotous snowballing, because nothing says moral guidance like imprisonment for accurate aim. But adults didn't escape the joy embargo either. Carnivals, travelling circuses, and pantomime troupes were treated as infestations, noisy, unregulated, and dangerously fun. Town councils routinely banned them, citing fears of public disorder. In reality, many simply didn't want the working classes gathering without supervision. The Victorian ideal of leisure was quiet, controlled, and preferably indoors. Hence the rise of improving amusements, tea parties, temperance lectures, and the endlessly thrilling pastime of listening to someone read poetry aloud until the will to live gently evaporated. The great irony was that the upper classes could still indulge in entertainment, just not in public. Theatres, private balls, gentlemen's clubs, and country hunts all flourished, protected by money and manners. What was considered riotous when done by factory workers was cultured when done by baronets. A servant dancing in the street was vulgar, A duchess waltzing in candlelight was refinement incarnate. The difference was simply the price of admission. Even seaside holidays, which we now associate with carefree Victorian charm and striped bathing suits and penny arcades, were once viewed with horror. Early travel writers scolded the lower classes for turning the beaches into spectacles of vulgarity. Heaven forbid someone build a sandcastle without aristocratic supervision. One scandalised observer in Brighton complained that bathing machines conceal nothing but decorum. The implication was clear. The working class couldn't even splash in the waves without threatening civilization. Of course, the suppression of fun didn't go unchallenged. People found loopholes. Fairs went underground, rebranding as charity bazaars. Street musicians disguised their performances as moral recitations. Even games adapted, football, then a violent free-for-all played in muddy streets, eventually reinvented itself into an organised sport complete with rules and uniforms, precisely to avoid being outlawed. It was the great irony of Victorian morality. In trying to outlaw pleasure, they accidentally invented modern entertainment. Meanwhile, the reformers themselves couldn't quite resist what they condemned. Reports describe moral crusaders inspecting fairgrounds for research purposes, only to be spotted later enthusiastically sampling toffee or testing the shooting gallery. One pamphleteer warned that public amusements are the road to ruin, which might have been more convincing had he not been caught at the fair 3 days later trying to win a stuffed parrot. By the late 19th century, attitudes began to loosen. The industrial work week was brutal, and even the government grudgingly admitted that people needed rest. Public parks were created, though initially with signs forbidding laughter, music, and ball games. Slowly, grudgingly, Britain began to rediscover the radical concept that fun might not lead directly to damnation. By the dawn of the Edwardian era, fairs were back, circuses drew crowds again, and music halls, once despised, had become the beating heart of working-class entertainment. But for a long grey stretch of the Victorian century, merriment itself was contraband. The empire that built railways, libraries, and an entire moral code somehow couldn't build a tolerance for joy. The good news? The Ferris wheel eventually won. The bad news? It took 50 years and several parliamentary debates for Britain to admit that laughter wasn't a sin. Victorian Britain loved mystery as long as it came with footnotes. This was an age of séances, spiritualists and scientific breakthroughs, where electricity was new, ghosts were fashionable, and the line between belief and disbelief was drawn with a trembling hand. But if you tried to make a living predicting the future, you weren't a mystic, you were a criminal. Under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, fortune-telling was officially classified as fraudulent practice, which meant that in the eyes of the law, reading someone's palm wasn't a harmless curiosity. It was a gateway to moral collapse. The Victorians' relationship with superstition was, as always, deeply contradictory. They publicly mocked fortune-tellers while privately consulting them. Newspaper editorials thundered about the charlatans of the dark arts, yet those same editors often had their horoscopes done discreetly on the side. The age of steam and science was also the age of crystal balls and tea leaves. Everyone claimed to be rational, but few could resist asking just one little question: will I be rich? The law, however, didn't share the fascination. Anyone caught pretending or professing to tell fortunes could be fined or imprisoned for up to 3 months. The offence wasn't technically against the supernatural, it was against the audacity of belief. To the courts, fortune-telling was theft of a different kind, theft of reason. The magistrates prided themselves on upholding rationality, even when the empire's most respectable citizens were spending their evenings talking to dead relatives through a table. Predicting your own arrest was the only safe prophecy. Fortune-tellers operated at every level of society. The working-class versions plied their trade in markets and taverns, offering palm readings and love charms for a few pennies. The middle-class versions rebranded themselves as spiritual advisors, magnetic healers, or clairvoyants, offering private consultations for a small fee and the promise of discretion. And then there were the upper-class mediums, the drawing room psychics who claimed to channel the spirits of ancient philosophers while wearing silk gloves. It was the same business, just with a better upholstery. Authorities were especially ruthless toward the poor practitioners. Street fortune tellers, often elderly women, were treated as public nuisances or witches in residence. Police records describe arrests for pretending to read palms, uttering incantations, or simply possession of suspicious cards. The trials were a mix of comedy and cruelty. One case in 1853 featured a woman accused of telling the fortune of a policeman's wife, a sting operation so profoundly British that it might have been written by Dickens on a bad day. The accused was asked to demonstrate her powers in court. She refused, saying that the spirits don't work for magistrates. The judge called this insolence. The public called it a standing ovation. Despite the risks, fortune-telling flourished. Human curiosity, it turned out, was immune to legislation. Love, money, and mortality, the great questions of existence, didn't stop being questions just because Parliament said so. People wanted to know if their husbands were faithful, if their sons at sea were safe, or if their employers would notice the missing cutlery. The fortune-teller's tent, or kitchen table, became a confessional for the desperate and the hopeful. Reformers called it the devil's hobby. Religious authorities claimed that fortune-telling invited demonic influence, while scientists dismissed it as gullibility gone mad. Yet for many Victorians, it was one of the few spaces where power ran in reverse. A maid who might be dismissed for speaking out of turn could command silence while reading her mistress's palm. A working man who had no control over his wages or fate could briefly believe the stars had plans just for him. That, more than anything, terrified the establishment. Fortune-telling gave people a language of personal destiny in a world designed to deny them one. If the poor started believing their fates could change, that luck, not birth, determined success, the whole class system might start to wobble. So naturally, it had to be suppressed for the good of the public. Even more alarming to moralists was the link between fortune-telling and romance. Palm readers and card diviners often specialised in matters of the heart, offering spells to win lovers or charms to keep them faithful. Newspapers fumed that these agents of immorality encouraged young women to defy parental authority, and occasionally they did. Stories circulated of girls who eloped after a fortune-teller predicted a dark stranger. Of course, the dark stranger usually turned out to be an unemployed fiddler, but the damage to propriety was done. Meanwhile, the same society that outlawed palm reading was gripped by the spiritualism craze. Seances, automatic writing, and spirit photography filled parlours across London. Mediums claimed to conjure the dead, and instead of being arrested, they were invited to dinner. Scientists attended seances with notebooks. Queen Victoria herself sought psychic advice after Prince Albert's death. The hypocrisy was astounding. Summoning your dead husband was considered spiritual. Predicting next week's weather was criminal. Not that this hypocrisy went unnoticed. Satirical magazines like Punch gleefully mocked it. One cartoon showed a fortune-teller behind bars reading her own palm and sighing, "I saw this coming." Another depicted a magistrate secretly consulting a crystal ball for guidance on sentencing. The public laughed, but the arrests continued. By the late 19th century, fortune-telling had gone professional again, legally grey, socially tolerated, and wildly popular. Advertisements began appearing in newspapers for Madame So-and-so, celebrated palmist and phrenologist. The trick was in the wording. Predicting was illegal, but advising was not. The cards were the same and the magic the same, only the grammar changed. It wasn't until the 20th century that fortune-telling was downgraded from a criminal act to a harmless eccentricity. But for decades, the Victorians treated it as both irresistible and forbidden, a guilty pleasure for the soul-starved and the curious. So that if you ever found yourself in 19th century London, clutching a shilling and wondering whether to see a fortune-teller, the advice was simple. Go ahead, but bring bail money. The good news, your future might look bright. The bad news, the constable's already on his way to confirm it. Victorian Britain adored entertainment as long as it behaved itself. Theatres, music halls, and concert saloons filled the cities with light and laughter, offering an escape from coal dust and factory hours. But heaven help you if your song contained a double meaning. The moral guardians of the 19th century had sensitive ears and wild imaginations, and if a tune made them blush, it was instantly branded a social emergency. Victorian audiences wanted entertainment, just not too entertained. The music hall was the beating heart of popular culture. Long before radio or cinema, it was where the working and middle classes gathered for beer, laughter, and the occasional off-key piano. The songs ranged from patriotic ballads to cheeky comic numbers, and it was those cheeky ones that caused trouble. Lyrics that today might barely raise an eyebrow were, to the Victorians, evidence that civilization was teetering on the edge of moral ruin. Take, for example, the infamous hit "She was one of the early birds and I was one of the worms." To modern ears, it's a playful pun. To Victorian magistrates, it was a coded confession of sin. Or "Ta-ra-ra boom de a jaunty little tune about a flirtatious woman banned in several towns for being suggestive. Even innocent-sounding titles like "Hold Your Hand Out, Naughty Boy" sent the prudish into full moral lockdown. The nation that built an empire on an industrial steam apparently couldn't handle a saucy rhyme about flirtation. The panic wasn't just cultural, it was legal. Under the Theatres Act of 1843 and subsequent morality statutes, local authorities had the power to revoke licences for indecent performances. Indecent, of course, was conveniently vague. It could mean bawdy lyrics, revealing costumes, or a performer who smiled at the wrong moment. Theatre inspectors, usually retired soldiers or clergymen with too much time and too little humour, attended shows to take notes. Imagine a man with a notebook and no sense of rhythm tasked with identifying sin in rhyme and metre. In their reports you find a strange kind of poetry. One inspector described a routine as a vulgar performance involving fruit and moral decline. Another banned a song because it induced laughter of a questionable nature. God forbid anyone laugh at the wrong octave. Some towns even hired undercover constables to sit in the audience and monitor applause. One policeman testified in court that the crowd roared excessively at a refrain implying naughtiness. It was apparently the sound of society collapsing. The censorship crusade was led by the self-styled moral reformers, a coalition of clergymen, politicians, and very bored social activists. They organised committees with alarming names like the Society for the Suppression of Vice and the Vigilance Association for the Maintenance of Public Decency. Their mission to purify entertainment by draining it of joy. These were the same people who believed that laughter weakened the will and melody distracted from prayer. To them, a music hall was not a theatre but a moral minefield. Yet, predictably, they couldn't stay away. Moral reformers often attended the shows for research purposes, sitting in the back with furrowed brows and scribbling notes while trying not to tap their feet. One journalist dryly observed, "They condemn the songs most enthusiastically, having memorised every verse." The working class, meanwhile, adored the music halls. These were spaces where people could laugh at their bosses, mock the rich, and forget the soot for an evening. The humour was earthy, not evil. Double entendres and winks were the lifeblood of working-class wit, a way of poking fun at authority without being directly treasonous. A risque joke wasn't rebellion. It was therapy with a piano accompaniment. But moralists weren't amused. They warned that bawdy songs would corrupt the nation's youth, destroy marriages, and inflame the lower instincts. Clergymen gave sermons about the perils of rhythmic depravity. Pamphlets warned parents that a single evening in the music hall may undo years of Sunday schooling. It's hard not to admire their dramatic flair. They made cheeky chorus lines sound like demonic incantations. The courts took these warnings seriously. Singers and theatre owners were routinely prosecuted for indecent performance. One case in 1877 involved a music hall star fined for winking during a song about laundry. The magistrate declared, "It was clear to this court that the wink was improper and intended to convey corruption." The singer, ever quick-witted, replied, "Your worship, it was merely soap in my eye. she paid the fine anyway. Women performers bore the brunt of the scandal machine. Music hall stars like Mary Lloyd, Bessie Bellwood, and Vesta Tilley became household names precisely because they walked the fine line between propriety and provocation. Marie Lloyd, in particular, was adored by audiences for her playful innuendo. Songs like "A Little of What You Fancy Does You Good." To the public, she was a heroine of humour. To the authorities, she was a walking crisis. Lloyd was repeatedly censored, once told that her act was unsuitable for respectable ears. She simply performed it elsewhere to thunderous applause. Even so, the reformers persisted. They tried to replace the bawdy halls with moral entertainment, sober variety shows filled with hymns, patriotic recitations, and lectures on hygiene. Audiences responded by staying home. The people wanted laughter, not lectures. And then came the delicious irony. The same upper classes who condemned music halls soon began copying them. Aristocrats hosted drawing room entertainments, where they performed sanitized versions of working-class songs. A duke could sing a naughty lyric in private and be called charming. A barmaid could sing the same line in public and be fined. The double standard, as ever, was impeccable. By the late Victorian era, the moral panic began to fade, defeated not by the revolution, but by repetition. The songs kept coming, and the crowds kept laughing. New technologies, gramophones and sheet music, spread the tunes far beyond the reach of censors. The empire that once arrested singers for cheekiness now exported those same songs around the world. Looking back, it's hard not to smile at the irony. The Victorians built one of history's most powerful empires, but they trembled before a punchline. The good news, the music halls outlasted their critics. The bad news, so did the critics. They just became theatre reviewers. For all their polished manners and lace handkerchiefs, Victorians had one very unpleasant national habit: spitting everywhere, on pavements, in carriages, on staircases, in church pews, even on the floors of Parliament. The average Victorian could discuss Plato while simultaneously launching a small wet missile onto the nearest cobblestone. It wasn't considered rude. It was simply biology with attitude. But as the century wore on and the empire discovered both germ theory and shame, spitting transformed from a reflex into a public menace. Cough once, it's plight. Spit once, it's a crime. Early in the century, nobody thought twice about it. The air was thick with soot. The streets reeked of horse manure, and people chewed tobacco the way others chewed their thoughts. Everyone had a cough, a byproduct of coal smoke, industrial fumes, and the general experience of existing in London. Spittoons were as common as teacups. They stood proudly in taverns, railway stations, offices, and even drawing rooms, gleaming brass reminders that bodily fluids and civilization could, apparently, coexist. But by the 1860s, the tide began to turn. The emerging science of public health started to notice something disturbing. Cities were basically disease buffets. Cholera, influenza, and tuberculosis spread faster than gossip, and the culprits weren't just dirty water or bad air, they were people, particularly people who spat. Doctors began writing alarmed papers about the deadly projectiles expelled from the lungs of the infected. One 1873 medical journal described each gob of spit as a microscopic arsenal of contagion. Suddenly, spitting wasn't just disgusting, it was treason against hygiene. The moralists seized on this with evangelical zeal. Cleanliness had always been a Victorian obsession, but now it came with science's blessing. Spitting in public became the perfect enemy, visible, vulgar, and conveniently punishable. By the 1880s, city councils began passing local bylaws forbidding it in public buildings, railways, and trams. Signs appeared everywhere. Do not expectorate. The word alone sounded like something invented to ruin a good afternoon. Public health crusaders framed it as a matter of both morality and class. To spit was to announce that one belonged to the unwashed masses. Middle-class etiquette manuals began, including sections on the abominable habit of expectoration. One particularly smug guide advised gentlemen to restrain the impulse as one restrains profanity, because nothing says moral superiority like comparing mucus control to virtue. Of course, enforcement was another matter entirely. The working class viewed anti-spitting laws as just another way for the rich to criminalise being alive. Many labourers worked in dusty, smoky conditions that made coughing inevitable. When they spat, they weren't being rude. They were clearing their lungs of half a day's soot. But to the middle class, every droplet was a reminder of moral deficiency. It was the perfect Victorian moral equation. Hygiene equals virtue. Phlegm equals sin. Doctors, meanwhile, became the new prophets of purification. Pamphlets warned of the invisible filth of the lungs spreading through shared spaces. Health exhibitions displayed magnified germs to horrified audiences who reacted as though they'd seen the devil himself in a microscope. Newspapers joined the crusade, publishing editorials like "The nation that spits shall perish." Spoiler, it didn't. The railways were particularly enthusiastic about enforcement. Train carriages became ground zero for anti-spitting campaigns. Conductors were instructed to issue warnings, and repeat offenders could be fined up to 10 shillings, the same penalty as public drunkenness. One exasperated inspector wrote that he collected no fewer than 66 cigars, 2 umbrellas, and 6 men's worth of expectoration on a single journey. Passengers were encouraged to report offenders, though one suspects few had the courage to turn around mid-cough and shout, "Sir, you're under moral arrest." Public spittoons, once symbols of refinement, suddenly became controversial. Reformers argued that they only encouraged the habit. Others worried about servants having to empty them, which was perhaps the first and last time Victorian reformers ever worried about servants. Some cities banned spittoons outright, forcing tobacco chewers into moral exile. Predictably, this led to creative rebellion. Reports surfaced of men spitting discreetly into handkerchiefs, gloves, and occasionally their hats, the latter being a move of such horrifying commitment that it deserves a footnote in medical history. Yet not everyone agreed with the crusade. The backlash came from the old guard, those who believed that anti-spitting laws were an attack on personal freedom. Letters to the Times complained that the right to expectorate is as English as the right to speak one's mind. Others saw it as unmanly to suppress such a natural act. One satirist grumbled, "Soon they'll forbid sneezing for fear we expel our souls." Even the medical community wasn't entirely united. Some doctors argued that suppressing the urge could cause internal congestion or melancholy of the lungs. Victorian medicine had a flair for poetic nonsense. But the real shift came with tuberculosis, the white plague that terrified the nation. Once scientists proved that TB bacteria spread through spit droplets, the moral debate ended. Spitting was no longer bad manners, it was bioterrorism. By the 1890s, anti-spitting posters adorned factory walls, schools, and public halls. The messaging grew aggressive. Spit and you spread death. The tone was less educational, more exorcism. In Manchester, police patrolled tram stops issuing fines to habitual offenders. In Leeds, one man was reportedly arrested for spitting into a puddle. The puddle, as it turned out, was in front of a city official's house. Justice was swift, if a little soggy. The movement even made its way into domestic life. Middle-class wives became enforcers of home hygiene, berating husbands for careless expectoration. Some households placed signs above the hearth, "No spitting near the fire," a rule that, while sensible, likely killed dinner conversation. Newspapers printed letters from concerned citizens suggesting ever more inventive punishments, from public shaming to, in one case, compulsory mouth-rinsing stations at every street corner. And yet, despite all the outrage, people kept spitting. Old habits die hard, and older lungs die harder. Even into the Edwardian era, reformers lamented that the streets glisten with the offences of the careless. Eventually, improved sanitation, changing habits, and the slow death of tobacco chewing did what all the laws couldn't. It made public spitting unfashionable. Still, the crusade against expectoration says everything about Victorian Britain, a nation that tried to legislate its way into moral cleanliness. It wasn't enough to wash your hands, you had to wash your soul, preferably in public. The good news? The Victorians finally curbed a disgusting habit. The bad news? They made it sound like the end of civilization in the process. If you ever need proof that Victorian Britain could make a moral crisis out of anything, look no further than how it treated its children. In a society that adored sentimental paintings of cherubs and bedtime sermons about innocence, the same empire filled its prisons with the very image of what it claimed to protect. The Victorians had a grim gift for contradiction. They built orphanages with one hand and workhouses with the other, and when those failed, they built jails, child-sized ones. In the eyes of Victorian law, childhood wasn't an age. It was an inconvenience. Poverty had no patience for youth and justice even less. A child could be tried as an adult as soon as they were old enough to reach the witness box. And while the law claimed to distinguish between juvenile mischief and criminal intent, in practice the difference often depended on who your parents were, or if you had any at all. The streets of industrial Britain teemed with children. Some sold matches, others swept chimneys, and many simply tried to survive by any means that didn't involve starvation. But in a moral universe obsessed with respectability, survival itself was suspicious. Police trained to view poverty as crime in progress, treated ragged children as future felons waiting for their cue. Steal a loaf of bread, get shipped to Australia, steal a button, and congratulations, you are officially part of the criminal class. Victorian justice, half your height, double your sentence. Court records from the 1840s and 1850s read like parodies written by Dickens's crueler cousin. A boy, age 7, sentenced to 14 days hard labour for taking a turnip. A girl aged 10, convicted for stealing a tin whistle. A youth of 9 sentenced to 3 months for purloining a rabbit. There was no minimum age for imprisonment. One magistrate even boasted that no child is too young to learn the weight of consequence. The phrase had a certain poetry, if you ignored the part where consequence meant a cell the size of a coffin. Many of these children were orphans or street Arabs, as the newspapers called them, not out of affection, but because it made the poor sound foreign and therefore easier to despise. They lived in alleyways, slept under bridges, and scavenged whatever industrial civilization discarded. For the police, they were the dangerous class, a phrase that managed to sound both pompous and heartless. Reformers claimed to pity them while demanding their removal from public sight. A hungry child reminded society of its failures. So naturally, the solution was to label them criminals and make them disappear behind stone walls. Inside those walls, the education was brutal. Before the rise of proper reform schools, young offenders were thrown into adult prisons. Imagine a 9-year-old thief sharing a cell with a murderer, a kind of early Victorian mentorship program in despair. Later, juvenile reformatories were introduced, claiming to rehabilitate through discipline and prayer. In reality, they were miniature prisons with better branding. Children rose before dawn, marched in lines, and performed hours of hard labour, stone-breaking, oakum-picking, or scrubbing endless corridors in silence. Conversation was forbidden, reflection was mandatory. Idleness breeds sin, their instructors told them, as if exhaustion were salvation. The lucky few who avoided prison ended up in industrial schools, institutions designed to turn vagrant youth into obedient workers. There they were trained in the noble arts of boot polishing, wood cutting, and subservience. Boys learned trades fit for servitude. Girls learned to sew, clean, and curtsy. The empire's future was safe if your dream job involved scrubbing someone else's dishes. The hypocrisy was staggering. Middle and upper class children were idealized as fragile angels in need of protection. They had nurseries, governesses, and moral instruction in the virtues of kindness, all while poor children were flogged for demonstrating hunger. Children of privilege played with toy soldiers, children of poverty made real ones. If you ever wanted a snapshot of Victorian morality, picture one child clutching a silver spoon and another clutching a summons. Even literature couldn't ignore it. Dickens turned child cruelty into a national spectacle. Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, and Bleak House all laid bare the absurdity of a system that punished the powerless. And yet the stories didn't exaggerate much. In 1861, a boy named James Guilford, age 8, was sentenced to a month in prison for stealing coal to keep warm. When questioned, he told the judge, "I only wanted a fire." The newspapers called it a sad but instructive case. The only lesson learned was that mercy was not Victorian Britain's favourite virtue. By the late 19th century, reformers finally began to challenge the madness. Campaigns led by figures like Mary Carpenter and Lord Shaftesbury pushed for humane treatment of young offenders. They argued that children weren't born wicked, they were born poor. Their efforts led to the Youthful Offenders Act, 1854, and the gradual expansion of reform schools over prisons. But progress was slow, and punishment remained the empire's love language. Even as psychology emerged as a science, the notion of the criminal child persisted, an unsettling blend of pseudoscience and prejudice. Phrenologists measured skulls to detect moral defect. Doctors warned of hereditary degeneracy. A poor child wasn't seen as a victim of circumstance, but as a ticking social time bomb, destined to explode into vice unless restrained early. This logic gave birth to the idea of preemptive punishment, arresting children for being poor before they committed crimes. Victorian justice, efficiency meets cruelty, and so the cycle spun on. The prisons filled, the reform schools overflowed, and the moralisers congratulated themselves for protecting society from its most defenceless members. It took decades and the rise of modern juvenile courts to finally separate childhood from criminality, but the scars remained. Behind every statistical report on juvenile delinquency was a child who'd been punished for needing food, warmth, or play. Behind every moral sermon on discipline was a system terrified of empathy. The good news? Britain eventually learned to treat children as children. The bad news? It took an entire century of proving they weren't born felons. Victorian Britain had an extraordinary talent for turning tragedy into moral philosophy. Starving? You lacked character. Sick? You probably sinned. Living in a rat-infested slum with a sewage bubbling through the floorboards? Well, clearly you'd made poor life choices. It was a golden age of double standards, one where landlords escaped blame while tenants were prosecuted for their own misery. If your roof leaked, it was your moral failing. In the 19th century, industrial cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool exploded with population growth. Workers poured in to build the empire's factories, railways, and dreams of progress, and found themselves rewarded with housing that could best be described as breathing optional. Whole families crammed into one damp room, often windowless, where the air was a cocktail of smoke, mildew, and despair. But in the great moral arithmetic of Victorian Britain, poverty wasn't a problem to solve. It was a character flaw to manage. Legally, landlords bore almost no responsibility for their properties. If a building collapsed or flooded, the owner was considered unfortunate, not negligent. Tenants, on the other hand, could be fined for creating a nuisance if their living conditions offended public sensibility. It didn't matter that the nuisance was the direct result of an absent landlord and a century's worth of rot. The logic went something like this. If your ceiling is dripping, perhaps you should have prayed harder. The nuisance removal. Acts of the 1840s and 1850s were intended, on paper, to improve public health. In practice, they often punished the poor for being visible. Inspectors could declare a property unfit for habitation, not to help the tenants, but to evict them. Once out, they were someone else's problem, or more likely no one's. The houses themselves remained standing, awaiting their next desperate occupants. Reformers celebrated each cleared slum as a victory for civilization. The tenants, displaced and homeless, were never invited to the ribbon cutting. And then there were the landlords, the quiet winners of moral capitalism. Many were absentee owners who had never stepped foot in their own properties. They viewed housing as an investment, not a responsibility. Rent was collected weekly, often by intimidating agents who demanded payment regardless of leaks, filth, or plague. The same city that fined tenants for dirty walls refused to fine landlords for collapsing ones. When inspectors finally did intervene, it was often for the wrong reasons. Public health in the Victorian sense didn't mean human health. It meant don't let the rich smell the poor. The miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through foul air, encouraged authorities to treat poverty like an airborne contaminant. Slums weren't cleared because of compassion, they were cleared because their stench offended nearby property owners. Cleanliness wasn't a right, it was a privilege of distance. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Wealthy Victorians romanticised poverty in novels, sermons and art, all while criminalising it in reality. The same audience that wept over Oliver Twist supported laws that punished real Olivers for obstructing the pavement. Philanthropists toured slums in carriages, remarking on the picturesque misery through scented handkerchiefs. Some even collected souvenirs, a lump of soot, a photograph, perhaps a brick from a condemned tenement, proof that they had witnessed poverty without having to touch it. Women, as usual, bore a disproportionate share of the blame. Poor mothers were accused of moral laziness if their children looked ateak or sick, as though soap could fix hunger. Magistrates routinely soldiered women for neglecting domestic order, while sentencing them to jail or workhouses that guaranteed further neglect. One judge even declared, "A clean home is the mark of virtue, regardless of circumstance." Spoken like a man whose home was cleaned by servants. The workhouse system only amplified the cruelty. Families who couldn't pay rent were relocated to these institutions, where men, women and children were separated and stripped of dignity in the name of discipline. Workhouses were marketed as charitable sanctuaries, but in reality they were punishment for failure, a social quarantine to keep poverty from spreading to polite neighbourhoods. Even here, architecture did the moral heavy lifting. Narrow corridors, echoing stone and uniforms that erased identity. Poverty wasn't cured, it was institutionalised. Yet despite all this, the empire's conscience occasionally flickered. Reformers like Octavia Hill and Charles Booth began documenting the inhuman conditions of the urban poor. Booth's maps of London, colour-coded by wealth, revealed vast swathes labelled simply vicious semi-criminal. It wasn't a condemnation of crime but of class. Even his data, meant to inspire empathy, inadvertently painted poverty as pathology. Meanwhile, landlords continued to profit. Rents were often higher in slums than in respectable districts, not because the housing was better, but because desperation inflated demand. "You can't evict someone who has nowhere else to go," one landlord reportedly said, "so you may as well charge them double." The result was a grotesque inversion of morality. Those with the least paid the most, and were punished for complaining. The newspapers sometimes tried to sound sympathetic, but even their compassion came laced with accusation. Articles described the poor as improvident and accustomed to filth. Illustrations showed slum dwellers as shadowy, half-animal figures. The message was clear, and poverty wasn't a product of the system, it was the system's necessary contrast. The clean needed the unclean to feel superior. By the 1890s, the tide began, slowly, to shift. The rise of social housing campaigns and the Public Health Acts brought genuine reform. Local councils gained authority to demolish dangerous buildings, provide sanitation, and eventually construct public housing. Yet even these victories were tainted by moral policing. New housing projects often required tenants to prove their respectability before moving in. Poor, yes, but politely so. For much of the Victorian age, poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a conviction. To be poor was to be guilty of failure, laziness, or simply existing in the wrong class. Landlords could neglect, cities could ignore, and governments could moralise, but the final judgment always fell on the tenant. And if your roof leaked, it wasn't an architectural problem. It was more, according to Victorian wisdom, a sign that God and your landlord disapproved of your life choices. The good news? Social reform eventually began to treat housing as a human need. The bad news? It took a century for Britain to admit that damp walls weren't a sin. If you asked a Victorian whether they loved animals, the answer would have been an emphatic yes, followed by the sound of a whip cracking, a carriage horse collapsing, and someone ordering roast beef for supper. No society in history has prided itself more loudly on compassion toward animals, while simultaneously finding new and creative ways to torment them. The Victorians loved animals, preferably dressed, roasted, and garnished. It was an age of contradictions wrapped in horsehair upholstery. On one hand, Britain became the birthplace of organised animal welfare. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, SPCA, later granted royal status, was founded in 1824, decades before anyone thought to create a similar group for protecting children. Parliament passed laws against beating dogs and baiting bulls. Poets wept over canaries. Aristocrats posed for portraits with lapdogs that looked better fed than half of London. And yet step outside any drawing room and you'd see horses whipped until they foamed, cats hurled into rivers for sport, and street dogs kicked by men in top hats who'd just donated to the SPCA. The heart of this hypocrisy was the Victorian obsession with respectable compassion. It wasn't cruelty that offended them, it was vulgarity. Torturing an animal for fun was barbaric. Doing it for work was unfortunate necessity. The same man who denounced dogfighting as a moral outrage might spend his afternoon disciplining his carriage horse for slowing down. Social class determined the morality of your cruelty. The upper classes called it management. The poor called it dinner. Nowhere was this double standard more visible than on the streets. Horses were the engines of empire, pulling omnibuses, drays, carriages, and carts from dawn to dusk. London alone had over 300,000 working horses by mid-century, and nearly all of them suffered. They hauled tons of cargo through filth and fog, slipping on cobblestones until their knees were raw. Whips and goads were constant companions, justified as encouragement. When a horse finally collapsed from exhaustion, a common sight, it was described euphemistically as fallen. A passing crowd might tut about the sad spectacle before stepping over the body to catch their next cab. Public outrage flared occasionally, but mostly for the wrong reasons. When reformers proposed limiting how many hours horses could work, critics scoffed that it would disrupt commerce. The cruelty wasn't hidden. It was normalised, industrialised, and rationalised. As one cynical journalist wrote in Punch, "The horse is man's noblest companion until it stops." And then there was the butcher's world, the slaughterhouses tucked behind markets and alleys, where animals met their end without anaesthesia, regulation, or dignity. Reformers campaigned for more humane slaughter, but the real goal wasn't mercy, it was sanitation. Blood offended middle-class sensibilities more than suffering. Meat should arrive clean, neatly wrapped, and free of reminders that it had once walked and blinked. The Victorians loved animals, but preferably posthumous. Meanwhile, the same newspapers that condemned cruelty to pets gleefully advertised fox hunts. Nothing thrilled the rural gentry quite like galloping across private estates while hounds tore a terrified fox to pieces. It wasn't called cruelty, it was called tradition. Aristocrats defended it as character-building exercise, as though murdering small wildlife instilled leadership skills. Anti-hunt activists, mostly women, were dismissed as sentimental meddlers. After all, empathy was unbecoming of one's class. Even the rise of vivisection, the practice of experimenting on live animals for medical research, exposed the moral schizophrenia of the age. Scientists defended it as progress. Opponents called it legalized torture. The debate became fierce, with public lectures and pamphlets describing animals strapped to tables, dissected without anaesthetic in the name of discovery. Yet because the perpetrators wore lab coats instead of aprons, their cruelty was seen as intellectual, not barbaric. Victorian science could split an atom of plural logic without blinking. Ironically, pets themselves became symbols of virtue. The growing middle class embraced pet keeping as a mark of gentility. Dogs, cats, canaries, even turtles were pampered, named and moralized. Keeping a pet wasn't just affection, it was character training. A kind owner, Victorians believed, demonstrated moral refinement. Animal affection became a substitute for emotional warmth in human relationships. Husbands ignored their wives but doted on their spaniels. Children starved but cats got milk. The home might be loveless, but the Labrador was thriving. For women especially, pet ownership offered a rare space of control and compassion. A lady could fuss over her dog or parrot without scandal, unlike fussing over politics or ambition. The pet became a socially acceptable outlet for affection in a world that punished female emotion. Thus, drawing rooms filled with well-fed lapdogs, while the streets filled with emaciated strays. It was empathy by invitation only. Satirists noticed, of course. Punch magazine published endless cartoons of ladies cooing over their poodles while ignoring beggars outside. One particularly biting sketch showed a woman crying over a dead canary while her servants starved in the corner. Another mocked a man who wrote to Parliament about cruelty to donkeys on his way home from a pheasant shoot. Victorian irony didn't have to travel far to find its targets. Still, the era did produce genuine progress. The SPCA's relentless campaigns slowly changed attitudes, at least on paper. By the 1870s, anti-cruelty laws gained teeth. Figuratively, the animals had lost theirs long ago. Dogfighting and bear baiting were largely eradicated. Horses got rest laws, and stray dogs were at least rounded up instead of shot on sight. These were real victories, but they came wrapped in moral smugness. To care for animals was no longer radical, it was fashionable. Compassion became another form of class display, philanthropy with fur. And inevitably, the empire exported this morality abroad. British colonists lectured other nations on animal kindness, while hunting elephants for sport and shipping exotic creatures back for private zoos. Nothing said civilized quite like conquering the world and then claiming the moral high ground over its treatment of pigeons. By century's end, the Victorian conscience had successfully convinced itself that Britain was the most humane nation on earth, and, in a strange way, it was, just selectively. If you were a fox, a horse, or a cow, your fate depended entirely on whether you were in a painting, a poem, or a pot. The good news, the Victorians gave the world the concept of animal welfare. The bad news, they also gave it the steak knife. Victorian Britain was a place where being a woman wasn't just difficult, it was potentially criminal. The law, the church, and polite society all agreed that a woman's greatest threat to order wasn't theft, treason, or violence. It was existing in a way that distracted men. You didn't need to break a law, just a man's concentration. Every part of Victorian society revolved around controlling women's behaviour. The legal system treated female morality like fine china, delicate, ornamental, and punishable if chipped. While men's vices were excused as unfortunate lapses, women's were catalogued as moral epidemics. There were actual legal categories for female misconduct, immodesty, idleness, and temptation. Translation: wear too little, rest too long, or smile at the wrong man, and you could find yourself in court. The most infamous example of this double standard was the Contagious Diseases Acts, 1864 to 1869. These laws, supposedly designed to control venereal disease in military towns, effectively criminalized women's bodies. Police were given authority to detain any woman reasonably suspected of being a prostitute. No evidence required, just suspicion. Once arrested, she was subjected to a forced medical examination so degrading it made prison look merciful. If she resisted, she was charged with obstruction. If she submitted, she was marked as unclean. It was legal puritanism with a stethoscope. The law didn't even pretend to target men. Soldiers and sailors who spread the same diseases faced no scrutiny whatsoever. The government justified this by claiming men were the victims of temptation. Women were the temptresses, naturally. The logic was breathtaking. Moral responsibility began and ended with the corset. Critics like Josephine Butler, one of the century's fiercest reformers, called it a system of slavery under the guise of public health. She led nationwide protests, risking her reputation to demand repeal. Parliament predictably called her hysterical. But prostitution wasn't the only moral minefield. A woman could be punished for appearing promiscuous without committing any act at all. Simply walking alone after dark, even to fetch medicine or bread, invited suspicion. Police and magistrates viewed independence as evidence of vice. Court transcripts are littered with cases of women arrested for loitering with intent, which often meant standing near a man while female. Immodesty covered everything from low necklines to loud laughter. The fashion police were real and occasionally armed with truncheons. Newspapers railed against the growing boldness of female attire, describing ankle-length skirts as invitations to indecency. A woman's clothing wasn't self-expression. It was a moral report card. If a man harassed you, the law asked first, well, what were you wearing? Spoiler, probably 15 pounds of fabric. Idleness was another crime, though more spiritual than statutory. The Victorian ideal woman was supposed to be industrious, sewing, cleaning, teaching, or fainting picturesquely in church. To rest, especially in public, was a dangerous luxury. Poor women sitting on stoops were accused of sloth. Rich women lounging on divans were praised for elegance. The same posture, different tax bracket, even laughter could land you in trouble. Unladylike mirth was cited in court as evidence of moral looseness. In one reported case, a woman fined for public disorder had done nothing more than giggle during a temperance rally. The judge scolded her for mocking virtue. She might have replied that virtue needed a better sense of humour. The hypocrisy ran so deep it bordered on performance art. Men frequented brothels, yet campaigned loudly for female purity. Clergymen thundered about fallen women, a term that implied gravity rather than social cruelty. Charities sprang up to rescue prostitutes by forcing them into laundry labour under supervision, where they worked, prayed and repented for their survival instincts. The Magdalene asylums, as these institutions were called, promised salvation through soap. Many never left. Meanwhile, ordinary working women faced moral scrutiny just for earning wages. Factory girls and barmaids were branded temptresses because they dared to exist near men unsupervised. A barmaid pouring ale for a customer could be accused of inviting corruption. A governess living in her employer's home risked gossip simply for breathing near his sons. Every workplace doubled as a moral tightrope. Respectable society didn't just police women's actions, it policed their excessions. Forwardness, meaning self-confidence, was treated like a contagious disease. Female ambition was repackaged as moral danger. Even the growing suffrage movement was condemned as immodesty disguised as politics. When women marched or published essays demanding rights, critics accused them of unsexing themselves. The term suggested that equality was a kind of anatomical error. Behind all this was the unspoken Victorian fear. A woman who thought for herself. The system relied on women embodying virtue so men could claim morality by proximity. If women started defining their own worth, the entire social structure, from marriage to manners, risked collapsing. So instead of granting freedom, society doubled down on decorum. The absurdity occasionally reached comedic heights. Manuals on female conduct advised women to avoid temptation by avoiding attention. In other words, be invisible, but gracefully. A truly virtuous woman, according to one etiquette guide, should move as though air alone acknowledges her presence, which is to say, if anyone noticed you, you were already halfway to ruin. Of course, women didn't just accept these rules, they learned to mock and manipulate them. Writers like George Eliot, who published under a male pseudonym, used fiction to expose the hypocrisy of moral womanhood. Satirists skewered the double standards in cartoons and plays, and activists like Butler Elizabeth Wolstenholme and Florence Nightingale fought back in public speeches, turning moral outrage into moral revolt. Still, the laws lingered. The Contagious Diseases Acts weren't repealed until 1886, long after women continued to face conduct charges that punished poverty, independence, and even visibility. Respectability was both armour and cage, necessary for survival, but deadly to freedom. In the end, Victorian morality boiled down to this: women were to embody virtue, men were to define it, and the law was to enforce it. The good news? Women eventually rewrote those rules. The bad news? They had to outwit an empire armed with etiquette manuals. If there was one institution that truly embodied the spirit of Victorian Britain, the hypocrisy, the moral panic, the paperwork, it was the justice system. It was equal parts sermon, theatre, and bureaucratic nightmare. The judges were stern, the prisons were full, and the laws multiplied like rabbits on caffeine. Officially, it was the age of reason and reform. In practice, it was an empire of overreaction. Justice was blind and occasionally drunk on power. By the mid-19th century, Britain was drowning in laws. Every new social problem, from vagrancy to indecent laughter, inspired Parliament to write another one. The Victorians were convinced that civilization could be achieved through sheer legal volume. Why solve poverty when you can criminalize it? Why improve housing when you can find people for living in it? The system didn't just punish crime, it manufactured it. Magistrates' courts became conveyor belts of morality. Each day, lines of bewildered citizens shuffled in, accused of offences ranging from public drunkenness to malicious vegetable theft. The punishments were delivered with industrial efficiency. A few days' hard labour here, a fine there, or if you were particularly unlucky, transportation to Australia. One magistrate in London reportedly sentenced 200 people in a single morning and still found time for lunch. The legal term for that level of productivity is mass moral panic. The petty crime explosion wasn't an accident. It was a system of social control disguised as righteousness. As cities swelled and poverty grew impossible to ignore, the upper and middle classes grew terrified that the working poor might stop being obedient. Crime, they decided, wasn't about need, it was about character. And what better way to enforce character than through the courts? The police weren't just law enforcers, they were moral referees. If you were poor, they didn't ask what you did, they asked why you looked like someone who might do it. Meanwhile, prisons overflowed. The 19th century began with old medieval dungeons and debtors' cells. It ended with a sprawling penal network that could have doubled as a tourism brochure for despair. The new model prisons, such as Pentonville, were built with architectural zeal, rows of identical cells where inmates could contemplate their sins in hygienic solitude. Reformers called it moral improvement. Prisoners called it staring at bricks until your soul evaporates. The separate system, a favourite among reformers, forced inmates to live and eat alone, forbidden from speaking even a word to another human being. Solitude, Victorians believed, would purify the mind. In reality, it produced a nation's worth of psychological breakdowns. Guards were instructed to watch for signs of madness, which they somehow found surprising after months of forced silence. One warden's report complained, "The prisoner converses with the walls." It didn't occur to him that the walls were the only ones listening. And while the prisons filled, so too did the paperwork. Every inmate was catalogued, measured and classified. The Victorians adored data, especially when it reinforced their biases. Criminologists began measuring skulls and noses, claiming they could identify the criminal type. One theorist, Cesare Lombroso, even suggested that criminality was hereditary, that some people were simply born to steal. Victorian Britain seized on that idea like a moral life raft. If crime was in the blood, then reform was unnecessary. Punishment wasn't cruelty, it was destiny management. The working class, predictably, bore the brunt of this pseudo-scientific enthusiasm. The phrase habitual criminal became the era's favourite label. allowing courts to imprison people indefinitely for the repeat petty offences, often things as minor as stealing food or being drunk and disorderly. Women faced even worse odds. Their crimes were treated as moral contagion. A man might be fined for brawling, but a woman might be locked up for corrupting decency by simply existing near him at the wrong time. For the truly poor, the workhouse became the unofficial annex of the justice system. Technically charitable, it functioned as prison light for those who hadn't yet committed a crime, but had the audacity to need help. Inside, families were separated, meals were rationed, and idleness was treated as sin. It was all designed to discourage dependency, and it worked, mainly by discouraging survival. As one reformer quipped bitterly, "We have abolished slavery by replacing it with paperwork." Yet through all its brutality, the justice system considered itself reformed. Compared to the hang-em-all 18th century, Victorian punishments were more civilised. Fewer executions, more sentences of hard labour. Fewer floggings, more sermons. The cruelty had become procedural, wrapped in forms, signatures, and pious language about redemption. The gallows had given way to bureaucracy, but the result was the same: suffering justified by moral superiority. The judges themselves were minor celebrities, self-styled moral architects in wigs. They lectured defendants as if auditioning for a pulpit, delivering speeches that lasted longer than the trials themselves. Court transcripts read like theatre reviews. The prisoner showed no contrition, one judge declared, and shall therefore reflect upon his sins for 6 months with bread and water. Bread, water, and a lifetime of irony. Behind the pomp, however, the system was cracking. By the 1880s, prisons were bursting at the seams, and the public began to notice. Reformers like Elizabeth Fry and John Howard campaigned for humane treatment, arguing that punishment without purpose was simply cruelty with paperwork. Slowly, ideas of rehabilitation began to emerge: education for prisoners, fairer sentencing, probation officers. But the reforms were uneven, and the public still loved a good punishment story. Newspapers printed lurid accounts of respectable criminals brought low, moral satisfaction sold as morning reading. The great irony, of course, was that many crimes were never crimes at all. Poverty, protest, prostitution, drunkenness, loitering, all treated as moral failures rather than symptoms of a broken economy. The justice system had become a machine for enforcing conformity. It didn't protect society so much as it protected the illusion that society didn't need protecting, that its structure was perfect, and only individuals were flawed. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain's jails were overflowing, its judges exhausted, and its reformers weary of writing pamphlets no one read. The empire had built an industrial-scale moral engine, but it was sputtering under its own contradictions. The good news? The Victorian era eventually passed, and with it, some of its absurdities. The bad news? The bureaucracy it birthed never did. Justice may have sobered up, but it still keeps the hangover paperwork.